Welcome to the Drowsy Historian, where we don't glorify history, we unpack its dirty laundry. Tonight, medieval England's servants, the people who worked, aged and vanished without a name. Chapter 1, Waking in the Shadows of the Manor. They weren't the heroes of epic poems, nor the villains in political plots. They weren't knights or monks or kings. No, the medieval English servant was the creaking floorboard you never noticed, always there, never heard, never thanked. And yet, without them, the whole rickety scaffolding of feudal life would have collapsed faster than a pig on ice. In this first chapter, we wake up in the unwashed skin of a medieval servant, a world of cold stone floors, barking orders, and an overwhelming lack of privacy or dignity. Let's begin before the cock crows, not poetic metaphor. Literally before the rooster has a chance to announce the dawn, a young servant, let's call him Edric, is already awake, not by choice of course. He shares a hay-stuffed sack with 3 others in a tiny corner of the manor's undercroft. No fireplace, no windows, just breath-clouded air. The scent of mildew and a draught that has plans to kill your toes by Christmas. One elbow to the ribs, a muttered curse, and it's time to rise. The Lord's hearth must be lit before he stirs. If Edric doesn't do it fast enough, someone else will, and take his miserable ration of bread with it. The first duty is fire. You'd think fire in a manor house is glorious. A roaring hearth, glowing embers, luxury. You'd be wrong. A servant's version of fire involves blackened fingertips, wet logs, and flint that never cooperates. It's like trying to start a bonfire with tears. The chimney is already clogged with last night's grease smoke, and ash dust dances into your nose while you kneel in freezing silence. Edric sneezes once. A mistake. Quiet, hisses Marjorie, the elderly laundress, whose temper ages worse than her joints. She's already dragging linens to the well, where the water is so cold it might qualify as solid. She's done this for 40 years. That's not devotion, that's just life with no other option. Now, while modern folks grumble about coffee machines or the horror of no Wi-Fi, let's get real. The medieval servant's morning routine involved hauling buckets of icy water, shoveling dung from the stables, and emptying the night's chamber pot. Chamber pots, in case you're lucky enough not to know, are glorified buckets of piss and worse. They have to be carried out, preferably before sunrise. Ever tried not to gag while navigating slippery stone steps with an open bowl of noble waste? Edric has, every single day. And don't assume every servant worked in a castle. Most served in manor houses, sprawling, drafty and badly lit. These weren't Hogwarts. They were functional machines of survival. Servants like Edric, Marjorie and a dozen others lived either below stairs, above kitchens, or quite literally in broom closets. Privacy was a luxury reserved for the Lord's lapdog. Even the act of scratching your lice-infested scalp was a shared experience. Don't be ridiculous. The Lord eats first, then his family, then the steward, then the chaplain, then the important guests. If there's anything left, it trickles down the pecking order like a charity rainstorm. By the time Edric gets a chunk of stale brown bread, it's been eyed by 10 others. Sometimes you get pottage, a vaguely edible stew. Sometimes it has meat. Sometimes it's just sadness in liquid form. Here's a dark fact. Medieval manors ran on servant misery. The lower your rank, the less you were paid, and some weren't paid at all. Instead you were you were fed, clothed and occasionally whipped into obedience. What a privilege. If you were an orphan or a bastard, common terms not slurs back then, you had 2 choices. Beg or serve. One gave you hunger, the other gave you hunger and back pain. Edric's father was a thatcher who fell off a roof. His mother died in childbirth. Service was the only road that didn't end in a ditch. Let's not pretend servitude was always brutal. There were lighter moments. If you were lucky, you served in a manor where the Lord didn't beat you for sneezing. You might get a laugh from a visiting jester, or hear gossip from the cook about who's bedding whom in the upstairs chambers. But these scraps of joy were fleeting, and yet, servants clung to them the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. Want a bit of dark humor? The law protected your master if he accidentally killed you. Reasonable chastisement, it was called. That's right. If Edric got smacked with a ladle and cracked a rib, it was just considered motivation. Too much attitude and suddenly you're replaced. No retirement plan, no severance, just kicked out with lice in your hair and calluses on your soul. As the morning stretches on, the manor wait, boots stomp above, and voices grow louder. The lady of the house rings a bell, not out of politeness, but because that's how humans summon dogs and servants. Edric moves quickly, wiping his nose on his sleeve and grabbing the towel she'll use for washing. He's not allowed to speak unless spoken to. His job is to fade into the walls, obey before she finishes the sentence, and never ever meet her eye unless she's in a charitable mood. And let's be honest, medieval charity was mostly for reputation. Feed the poor on Sunday, beat your laundress on Monday. God forgives, after all. So as the sun finally breaches the trees and paints the manor's stone walls in gold, Edric and Marjorie have already put in 4 hours of labour. Their reward, not being fired, or worse, not being noted. Because in medieval England, being invisible was the only way to survive. Mid-morning in the manor house was not a time of rest. It was when things truly picked up speed, like a medieval treadmill, powered by obligation, dread, and dirt. Our poor servant Edric had already survived the sacred rituals of fire starting, waste hauling, and being scowled at by Marjorie, who by this point had slapped a stable boy with a wet rag and threatened to curse someone's stew. But the day was just stretching its grimy, calloused fingers. Now came the cleaning, real cleaning, not your Sunday feather dusting. We're talking scrubbing the stone floors with sand and lye, brushing soot from tapestries using stiff reeds, and picking parasites off the family dog because, heaven forbid, Lady Maud's spaniel have fleas. Edric moved from task to task, like a ghost in human form, his own thoughts barely allowed to exist. If he dawdled or missed a spot, there'd be complaints. And in a place where jobs were as replaceable as chamber pots, complaints could cost him his position, and that was just a medieval synonym for food. And while we're scrubbing the myth clean, no, medieval nobles did not bathe every day. They didn't even bathe weekly, but their clothes had to look pristine. Why? Because appearances mattered, not hygiene. So servants like Edric spent hours washing, stretching, starching, and folding garments worn by people who couldn't be bothered to wash their own backsides. Imagine that, laundering a tunic soaked with sweat, perfume, and hypocrisy. Let's not forget food prep. You'd think being near the kitchen might mean an extra bite or a sneaky sip. Think again, the kitchen was ruled by the cook, who ran her space like a fortress of fear and boiling grease. Edric was occasionally allowed to chop roots or pluck feathers, but even that came with risk. Cut your finger, tough. Bleed on the pheasant, you're flogged or fined. Complain, you're replaced with a boy from the village who knows how to keep his mouth shut and his blood in his body. Meanwhile, outside the manor walls, there were peasants who toiled in the fields. And somehow, they looked at indoor servants with envy. Imagine that. But truth be told, fieldwork was brutal but predictable. Servants, on the other hand, lived in the eye of a noble storm, with orders changing by the hour, tempers flaring without warning, and expectations being as high as the taxes the Lord never paid himself. Midday prayers marked a brief moment of stillness. Everyone had to pause, even the Lord, for chapel. Not because anyone was particularly holy, but because appearances again mattered. Edric would stand in the back, trying not to sway from exhaustion, mouthing Latin he didn't understand. The priest droned, the nobles nodded piously, and the servants prayed, not for salvation, but that their knees wouldn't buckle. Once prayers ended, dinner preparations began. This was the biggest job of the day. The Lord and his family would eat at noon, the main meal. If there were guests, it meant polish the pewter, shine the cutlery, and make sure no one dies of poisoning, intended or otherwise. Edric helped carry the heavy platters into the hall, stepping lightly over the rushes strewn on the floor. Rushes which were supposed to soak up spills, smells, and sins. By the end of the week, they soaked up everything but dignity. And remember, servants didn't eat with the nobles. That whole Downton Abbey illusion, that's centuries too generous. Most servants waited until the entire feast was done, and only then, if anything was left, they were allowed to scoop up the leavings. Bread crusts, gravy scraps, half-chewed bones. It was a medieval buffet for the desperate. Now here's a detail most people miss. Many of these servants were children. Yes, literal children. Boys and girls as young as 7 were sent into service to learn discipline and make themselves useful. A peasant family might offer up a daughter to serve a noble lady, hoping she'd be treated well. She wouldn't. She'd be overworked, underfed, and always one broken vise away from being sent home in disgrace, or worse, pregnant and accused of seduction, because naturally it was always the girl's fault. How convenient. Let's talk quickly about free servants. Yes, some were technically paid. They might get a coin a month, enough for a candle, not enough for a pair of shoes. Wages were a joke. Lodging and food were considered payment. Lodging, in this case, meant a straw mat under the stairs. And food, you know already. Rat stew if lucky, rat in the stew if unlucky. The hardest part of being a servant wasn't the back pain or the grime or the isolation. It was the total erosion of identity. Edric wasn't Edric. He was boy, led, you there. He had no surname, no legacy, no voice in the hall. If he died tomorrow, he'd be replaced by someone younger, thinner, and more afraid. And yet within this world, servants developed a quiet resistance through whispered jokes, secret smiles, and learned cunning. They knew which corridors creaked, which lords drank too much, and how to steal an extra moment of rest behind the pantry door. Marjorie, for all her scowls, could mimic the lord's wife so perfectly it once caused a maid to drop a whole tray of goblets. These tiny rebellions weren't enough to change the system, but they were enough to remind the servants that they were still human. By nightfall, Edric had completed more physical labor in one day than most modern desk workers would in a month. His hands were raw, his feet numb, his mind fogged with exhaustion. He curled into his corner under the stairs again, trying to find sleep beneath the snores and foot traffic above. Tomorrow would be the same, unless, of course, someone broke a plate. Then it might be worse. In the end, being a medieval servant in England was not romantic. It was survival by silence, a lesson in obedience taught through hunger, and it was the dirty, unspoken foundation upon which the entire castle was built. A reminder that while history loves its kings, it forgets who made their beds. Chapter 2. The hierarchy below the stairs. In the great halls of medieval England, everyone knew their place, but nowhere was this more painfully enforced than below the stairs. If you thought the nobility were obsessed with status, wait until you meet the servants, because inside the manor walls, there existed a second, hidden kingdom, a complex unwritten caste system among the very people scrubbing the same pots, fetching the same water, and occasionally passing out in the same hay pile. Our reluctant guide, Edric, now a few years older and slightly less naive, had learned this the hard way. When he first arrived at the manor, he assumed all servants were equal in their shared misery. That was adorable. In reality, the social ladder within the servant class was so finely sliced, it could make a mandolin blush. At the top was the steward, the king of the underworld. He didn't clean, cook, or carry. That meant ordering others to do things while wearing a slightly less stained tunic. The steward had the ear of the lord, the keys to the stores, and the right to dock your pay if you gave him a funny look. Think of him as a medieval middle manager, but with more power and less accountability. Then came the butler, not the polite, silver-haired British stereotype Hollywood loves, but a fiercely territorial wine hoarder. The butler controlled the buttery, where wine, ale and provisions were stored. You wanted a drop of cider on feast day, you better grovel, and don't even think about tasting without permission. A servant caught sipping could be flogged or dismissed. Meanwhile, the butler himself drank liberally, strictly for quality control, of course. Next in line, the cook. She, usually a she, and usually terrifying, was the fiery queen of the kitchen. Cross her and you'd find your next meal seasoned with regret. She ruled with a wooden spoon and an iron will. Burn the bread and she'd chase you into the yard with a ladle. Forget to gut the fish, enjoy cleaning privies for a week. But despite her temper, the cook held respect. She fed the manor, and in a world where starvation was always a season away, that made her untouchable. Below her were the kitchen boys, scullions, and spitjacks. Edric had rotated through all three roles at various points in his suffering. Scullions washed pots so large you could bathe in them. Not that anyone did, perish the thought. Spitjacks rotated massive skewers of meat over open fires until their arms ached and their brows dripped into the flames. Sometimes they were replaced by dogs or mechanical contraptions. That was called innovation. Edric once worked beside a large black mastiff named Solomon. The dog got better scraps. Laundry maids like Marjorie, who still hadn't died, somehow worked under the housekeeper, another feared figure. The housekeeper managed linens, soap stores and cleaning schedules with the precision of a military commander. She had the authority to redistribute sleeping spots and ration candles. In a world of damp halls and night terrors, light was currency. Now don't think gender exempted anyone from this pecking order. If you were a chambermaid, you had the dubious honor of cleaning the bedrooms, changing soiled sheets, emptying chamber pots, and occasionally hiding the evidence of noble indiscretions. You learned to keep secrets, and your reward, a coin at Christmas. If you were lucky, let's not forget the groom of the stables, who cared more for horses than people, and who could blame him? The horses didn't spit on you or make you polish their boots. The grooms worked outside in mud and manure, but they answered to the marshal, who made sure the lord's prized mare was fed better than most children in the village. Even among servants, there were the truly invisible. The boy who rang the bells, the girl who fanned the kitchen flame, the orphan taken in for pity and worked until her fingers bled. These weren't just jobs, they were positions in a hierarchy so rigid it would make a feudal baron blush. And what held this entire fragile pyramid together? Fear. Fear of dismissal. Fear of punishment. Fear of being seen as lazy, insolent, or replaceable. Because everyone was replaceable. One cough too many, one wrong look at a visiting knight, one rumor whispered in the wrong ear, and you were gone, thrown out with a bruised apple and a week's ration of regret. But here's the delicious irony. Though the hierarchy was enforced with all the subtlety of a battering ram, it didn't protect anyone. The steward might be top of the servant world, but he was still a servant. One bad ledger entry and he was out. The cook might have ruled the kitchen, but if the lord's wife choked on a fishbone, it was her fault. You climbed the ladder not for safety but for slightly better scraps and the illusion of control. Edric learned how to play this game. He knew when to bow, when to grovel, when to pretend he hadn't heard the mistress's secrets. He avoided eye contact with the steward and made sure to compliment the cook's turnip soup, no matter how much it tasted like boiled despair. And slowly, painfully, he carved out a spot just above the lowest rung, a scullion no longer, but not yet important enough to be missed. It was a game of survival, not success, because in the end, medieval service was not a ladder you climbed, it was a treadmill you ran on, until you dropped or were thrown off. Let's take a moment to really appreciate just how obsessively obsessed medieval society was with rank. Even among people cleaning the same floor with the same rag made from the same dead pig's hair. If you were lucky, you knew where you stood in the hierarchy. If you were really lucky, you didn't accidentally step above it. Because nothing, and I mean nothing, invited punishment faster than forgetting your place in the social food chain. Edric, now a veteran of mop and misery, knew exactly how dangerous it was to get too comfortable. One time he'd been caught laughing, actually laughing, in the presence of the under-butler. Just a chuckle, not even a real belly one. He paid for it with 2 days mucking out the pig stalls, which the lord kept not for food, but for the aesthetic of rustic abundance. And pigs, bless their filthy little souls, don't care about social order. They only care about rooting, rolling, and relieving themselves where Edric was expected to kneel. Even eye contact could be a crime. Looking directly at a superior servant was considered presumptuous. Looking at a noblewoman for too long, insolent. And if your eyes accidentally landed on a knight's wife while she was adjusting her bodice during prayers, congratulations. You're now permanently stationed in the dung pit. So yes, there were not just the lord's rules, but the internal codes among the staff, like never sitting in the wrong chair, never touching another's tools without asking, and for heaven's sake, never eating from the wrong pot. The cook had her own spoon, the butler had his own mug. Violate these sacred objects, and you'd be treated like you just insulted the Virgin Mary. But don't mistake this structured insanity for efficiency. The truth is, many manors ran more on drama than discipline. Jealousy brewed constantly. The housemaids hated the scullions for being too loud. The scullions mocked the laundresses for smelling like boiled underwear. The stable hands thought everyone else was soft. The under-butler, universally despised, he was the one who carried tales to the steward, inflated small errors into capital offences, and mysteriously never had to scrub anything himself. In a modern office, he'd be the guy who CCs the boss on every email, just to feel alive. And behind it all was the cold truth. Most of these roles were inherited. If your father was a steward, you might become one. If you had the spine for politics and a tolerance for wine-soaked nobles. If your mother was a laundress, congratulations. Your life will smell like damp linen forever. Social mobility, a nice fantasy. Real upward movement happened once in a generation, and usually by accident. Like catching the Lord's attention with your handwriting, or surviving a plague while others didn't. Nothing says promotion like outliving the competition. Then there was seasonal upheaval. During feast days or when the Lord travelled, the hierarchy became chaos. Temporary servants were brought in, untrained, unwashed, and unaware of who was supposed to boss whom. Fights broke out over broom closets. Arguments erupted over who got to serve wine or carve meat. One time, Edric watched 2 kitchen boys wrestle over who had the right to fetch firewood. Neither won. The cook hit them both with a ladle and sent them to the henhouse. Let's not forget punishment. The hierarchy not only defined power, it defined who got punished how. The steward might receive a verbal scolding, the butler might lose wine privileges. But Edric, if he made a mistake, he could be denied food, slapped, locked in a freezing pantry, or made to kneel on stone for hours. One particularly cruel lord was known to hang signs around a servant's neck. I am dirt. That was his version of team building. Yet through it all the servants endured. Why? Because the alternative was worse. Being dismissed meant returning to a village already drowning in poverty. No food, no roof, no prospects. And many servants, like Edric, had no family left. The manor was home, as bleak and joyless as that sounds, and the hierarchy, twisted as it was, gave order to a world that otherwise offered none. Marjorie, the ancient laundress, understood this. She'd outlived 2 cooks, 3 stewards and at least 1 plague. She never tried to rise higher. She just lasted longer. That, she told Edric once, was the real trick. Not climbing the ladder, just not falling off it. Of course, that didn't stop her from wielding her seniority like a weapon. She could guilt anyone into fetching wood or rinsing blood-stained sheets, always reminding them that she had seen worse. In 72, the rats were so bold they used to nibble soap, she once bragged. Edric didn't know if it was true, but he admired the commitment. Even humour had its place. Servants found ways to mock their superiors behind backs, of course. They mimicked the steward's pompous walk, invented songs about the butler's drinking habits, and told whispered tales of nobles who couldn't tell a fork from a comb. These jokes didn't dismantle the hierarchy, but they softened its grip. At the end of each day, the servants would slink back to their corners, their bones aching and dignity half buried under the weight of another man's wealth. And in that cramped, shared darkness, they remembered what truly mattered: staying unnoticed, unblamed, and just high enough to avoid the worst jobs. Because in the medieval servant world, survival wasn't noble, it was strategic. Chapter 3. The Lord's Command, the Servant's Burden. If you think your boss today is bad, you haven't met a medieval English lord on an empty stomach. In a world built on obedience and oaths, the nobleman's word wasn't just law, it was gospel, thunder, and the daily migraine of every servant within shouting distance. And shouting was frequent, because in the average manor house, communication trickled downhill like waste from an upper floor garderobe, messy, abrupt, and always landing on someone unfortunate like Edric. By now, Edric had survived 3 winters, 1 kitchen fire, and a personal scolding from the steward that included the phrase snail-brained knave. He was wiser, thinner, and faster with apologies. He'd learnt that when the Lord summoned, you didn't delay, even if you were ankle-deep in goat droppings or mid-chamber pot haul. The Lord's command came first, always, even if it made no sense, especially if it made no sense. Take, for instance, Lord Wulfric, the manor's owner and walking embodiment of entitlement. He once rang the summoning bell at dawn demanding that honeyed loaf from Yester's market. The problem, the market was 2 villages away, hadn't opened yet, and the baker's son had just died of the flux. But Wulfric didn't care. The servant dispatched, not Edric this time thankfully, walked 12 miles, paid triple with borrowed coin, and returned only to be told, "This crust is stale, feed it to the dogs." Because that's what lords did. They ordered and expected, with no concern for reality, logistics or human limitation. Servants were not people, they were functions, and if the function failed, the Lord's fury was considered both righteous and necessary. A dropped goblet, that could earn a slap or a boot to the ribs. A forgotten errand, a week's pay deducted, assuming you were paid to begin with. Here's the brutal twist. Medieval law actually supported this dynamic. Masters were legally allowed to discipline their servants, as long as it was deemed reasonable. Of course, reasonable was a fluid concept in a world where boiling someone's shoe for not polishing it fast enough wasn't immediately questioned, and a servant couldn't retaliate. If Edric so much as raised a hand, he'd be branded a rebel, beaten, or tossed into the stocks, or worse, evicted. In winter, into the woods, with wolves. So what did obedience look like in practice? Let's say Wulfric decided he wanted a bath. That was a production. The tub had to be hauled from storage, a massive wooden barrel with rusted iron hoops. Water had to be fetched from the well, heated over open flame, poured bucket by bucket. Scented herbs were added, not for skin health, but to cover the stink of unwashed noble flesh. While Wulfric soaked like a pickled onion, servants stood by with cloths, fresh garments and towels. He might snap his fingers for wine or demand poetry. If Edric flinched at a rhyme request, that was impudence, dangerous. Even worse was spur-of-the-moment whims. Sometimes lords would test loyalty. Fetch me a raven's feather, dig a trench by sundown, find out why the sun sets faster this season. The tasks were absurd, but they weren't jokes. They were traps, and failure meant humiliation. Or in Marjorie's case, having to clean the stables with only your apron. She still told that story like it gave her street cred. Maybe it did. But not all commands were bizarre. Many were simply cruel. Servants were made to escort guests who didn't want their company, to stay awake through night feasts only to clean vomit by torchlight, or to hold torches in hunting fields while nobles chased terrified animals through frozen bramble. One time, a stag gored a guest. Guess who got blamed? The torchbearer. His crime, standing too still. Edric once witnessed a scribe whipped for misreading a Latin phrase in a land grant. Never mind that the original was water-stained and half-eaten by mice. The Lord's embarrassment needed a scapegoat. He found one. The man was left with scars and a new limp, and no job. That's what the servant's burden truly was, bearing the weight of your master's mood, error, and ego. Critics of this system, and yes, they existed, usually scholars or clergy with just enough distance from the filth, occasionally preached about mercy and justice. But mercy is a quiet thing in a loud world. Lords heard what they wanted, saw what pleased them, and rewarded loyalty when it flattered them directly. A lord might gift you boots one day and flog you for sneezing the next. Consistency, that was for oxen, not aristocrats. And so servants adapt. They developed instincts, learned to read the curl of a lip, the flick of a ringed finger. They knew when to speak and when to vanish. Edric often joked to himself, never loud, that working under Wulfric was like serving an overgrown toddler armed with a wine goblet and the divine right of kings. Still, some commands were worse than others. There were times when a lord's order crossed into the realm of the immoral, when Edric was told to lie to visitors, or hide evidence of the lord's misdeeds, or quietly escort a weeping maid out the back gate before her belly grew too round. These commands didn't just bend your back, they chipped at your soul. And yet, disobedience wasn't an option. So the servant complied, swallowed his thoughts, did the job, and lived with the knowledge that the burden wasn't just physical, it was moral, psychological, existential. Because in medieval England, obedience wasn't a virtue, it was survival dressed in rags. It's easy to look at medieval servants and wonder, why didn't they just leave? But in truth, asking that is like asking a fish why it doesn't walk out of the ocean. For Edric and the hundreds of thousands like him, there was no outside. The manor was not just a place of employment, it was the only world they knew. Lords didn't issue commands merely as tasks, they issued them as declarations of existence. A command was a reminder of who mattered and who didn't. And if you were lucky enough to be on the receiving end of a gracious request from the master, you were still expected to drop whatever you were doing and jump into immediate action. Edric once spent 2 days preparing the guest room, beating the damp out of the mattress, fluffing the straw, chasing out a terrified chicken that had somehow taken up residence, only for Lord Wulfric to cancel the visit because of a dream. "The moon warned me," he said, without irony. That was the explanation. That was enough. Servants learned never to question. In fact, they learned to listen in advance, to sense a command before it was spoken. When the Lord's tone dropped an octave, when his cup sat empty for too long, when his mood swung from drunken joy to quiet brooding, that was your cue. Anticipation became an act of preservation. The more dangerous commands came not in the dining hall or bathhouse, but in private corridors, whispered under breath. "Deliver this letter, don't let the steward see it," or, "If anyone asks about the chapel door, you saw nothing." These were the moments when being a servant became something darker, part errand boy, part unwilling conspirator. Edric once had to carry a blood-stained tunic to a washerwoman 3 villages over, wrapped in a bundle and passed off as laundry. He didn't ask why, he knew better. And yet, amid the obedience and submission, there was also quiet calculation. Servants weren't stupid, they knew how to navigate. If you fulfilled a difficult command particularly well, say managing to prepare a last-minute banquet with no warning and only half a chicken, you might be rewarded. Not publicly, of course, but you might get a better sleeping space, an extra scrap of meat, even gasp, a name spoken aloud by the master. For example, Edric once arranged for the cook to borrow dried fruit from a neighbouring estate for the lady's birthday tart, a nearly impossible task completed with charm, luck and mild theft. When the tart was served, the lady smiled. Lord Wulfric naturally took credit for the idea, but afterward, Edric was quietly given a new cloak, coarse wool, patched but still warmer than rags. It wasn't justice, it wasn't even fairness, but it was something, and in service, something could feel enormous. Still, for every small reward, there was a corresponding punishment lurking in the shadows. Medieval servants could be dismissed without notice, without pay, and often without a reason. It wasn't illegal, it wasn't even unusual. Maybe the Lord suspected you of stealing, maybe a guest complained about your posture, maybe the stars didn't align that morning. Out you went. No appeal, no letter of reference, just an open road and closed doors. What made this more brutal was the public nature of shame. Punishments were meant to be seen. A servant whipped in private did not teach the others. A servant locked in the cellar without food, that sent a message. And while noble cruelty was rarely recorded in official manor records, who wants their family history to include beat 3 children over gravy? Oral history, remembered. Servants whispered tales long after the masters died. That's how fear lived on, through memory more than muscle. The church occasionally tried to soften the edges. Priests preached about mercy and charity, some even scolded lords for excess. But conveniently, these sermons often fell just short of condemning the system itself. After all, who paid for the new chapel window? Who sat in the front pew? Certainly not Edric. So religion, while a balm for the soul, rarely soothed the blistered feet of those below the stairs. And then came war, because every few years, some distant squabble, a border dispute, a royal feud, a papal insult, would turn into a call to arms, and the lords would ride out in armor, glorified and poetic. But behind them marched the pressed men, servants turned foot soldiers. Edric nearly ended up among them once, but the steward argued he was too useful with a ladle. Others weren't so lucky. They returned in splinters, if they returned at all. And when the master came back victorious, who welcomed him? The same servants, with banners they'd sewn by candlelight and smiles stretched thin as their shoes. They carried his bags, poured his wine, and listened to tales of valor, while ignoring the pile of muddy clothes soaked in someone else's blood. This was the burden of service, to support a life you'd never live, uphold a power you'd never wield, and follow orders without question, even when those orders rang hollow. Edric once asked Marjorie, "Do you think they ever see us?" She spat into the fire and said, "Only when we're late." Still, the burden was endured, because leaving meant starvation, staying meant slow erosion, and dreaming of something more, that was a dangerous luxury, like asking for a second bowl of stew. In a world where the command of a lord could bend time and truth, the servant's burden wasn't just obedience, it was invisibility, the kind you had to wear like armor. Chapter 4. The Kitchen Inferno. There are hells described in scripture, and then there is the medieval kitchen, a different kind of inferno, one not built on sin, but on service. If the manor was a body, the kitchen was its overheated, underloved stomach. Here, sweat didn't drip, it poured, fires didn't warm, they scorched, and every servant working within those stone walls had burns, blisters, and burns on top of blisters, to prove it. Edric had been rotated back into kitchen duty after an unfortunate misunderstanding involving Lord Wulfric's hunting boots and an aggressive chicken. The steward thought it would build humility. What it built instead was an intimate relationship with smoke, grease and knives, with dull handles and sharp edges. At the heart of this chaos stood Mistress Ellen, the cook, a woman whose voice could cut through a storm and whose spoon had left more bruises than the steward's cane. She ran the kitchen like a siege camp. There was no room for laziness, talking, or breathing improperly. Ingredients were shouted, not requested. Mistakes were punished with sarcasm, and if serious, with poultry to the face. And yet, despite her terrifying presence, Ellen was the reason anyone in that manor ate at all. She managed stores, calculated rations, and timed the roasting of meat to the Lord's unpredictable schedule. She knew which herb disguised rot, and which spice made spoiled wine smell noble. And while the noble family upstairs twirled their spoons and moaned about the salt, down below was a war to keep anything edible. Let's talk about the heat. The kitchen was a stone box with 2 hearths, no chimney that worked properly, and 0 ventilation. Smoke curled around rafters and clung to clothing like a jealous spirit. The walls wept grease. Fires burned all day, not for ambiance, but because bread had to rise, meat had to roast, and stews had to simmer endlessly. The ovens, made of thick clay, could hold the heat of a small star, and sticking your head too close, say while checking bread, was a fast way to lose your eyebrows. The air was a suffocating mix of ash, steam, and boiling fat. Slipping was common, so were burns. Edric once dropped a pot of lard onto his boot, and couldn't walk properly for 3 weeks. Ellen called it a lesson in grip strength, and she wasn't wrong. But the danger wasn't just from the fire, it was from the food itself. Ingredients arrived in all states of decay. There were no fridges, no preservatives, only salt, smoke, and hope. Meat was often green around the edges. Fish came stiff with death and layered in flies. Vegetables were shriveled. Fruit had already started fermenting. And yet, everything had to be turned into something that wouldn't offend the Lord's delicate sensibilities. That meant boiling, searing, pickling, and spicing, all done while hunched over splintered tables in a room that smelled like damp wool and cooked onion. Servants weren't allowed to sample what they prepared. Not officially, but everyone did. You couldn't survive 12 hours in that room without sneaking a bite, a crust here, a spoonful there. If caught, punishment was swift, but hunger trumped fear. Edric once pretended to drop a turnip so he could hide a small apple under the chopping block. He shared it later with a stable hand, who called him a saint. In truth, Edric was starving. Now let's debunk a myth. Medieval feasts were not daily affairs. They were reserved for saints' days, visiting nobles or marriages. On those days, the kitchen exploded into panic. Dozens of dishes were required. Pies, roasts, jellies, breads, stews, custards, and everything had to be presented with flair. Swans with feathers reattached, boars with apples shoved in their mouths, fish dyed with saffron to glow golden. The nobles expected magic, the servants produced it, with sweat, trickery, and long hours. Feast days meant waking before dawn, and collapsing well past midnight. It meant sharpening knives with stones, climbing into the loft to fetch dusty jars, and stirring cauldrons so heavy they needed 2 people to lift. Mistakes were not tolerated. Under-season the hare pie, disgrace. Oversalt the soup, humiliation. One kitchen boy dropped a dish mid-presentation, and was banned from the kitchen for a month. He nearly starved. Despite the toil, the kitchen developed a strange camaraderie. Amidst the panic, there were shared jokes, quick smiles, even moments of pride, like when Ellen actually praised Edric's spiced lentils with a grunted, "Not vile." That was practically poetry from her. And of course, the kitchen had its secrets. This was the place where gossip bubbled hotter than broth. Who was pregnant? Who was stealing wine? Who had a birthmark in the shape of a goose? The kitchen heard it all. Servants passed rumors like seasoning, quietly, hungrily, and always just within earshot of scandal. But it was also where you learned the truth about your own value. You were hands, not tools, not minds. You worked until your fingers split, until the burns became scars, until your body became a list of old injuries and habits. And when you were too slow, too old, too sick to keep up, you were replaced. Mistress Ellen had gone through 6 assistants in 3 years. The 7th lasted because he lost a thumb and didn't complain. The 8th, Edric, lasted because he knew how to keep his head down, his mouth shut, and his eyes open. Also because he learned to sleep while stirring. In the manor kitchen, survival wasn't about strength, it was about stamina, enduring the heat, the cruelty, the filth, because every plate that left the kitchen carried a piece of someone's suffering, hidden beneath sauces and garnishes. And the nobles, they never knew. They tasted the feast, complimented the flavor, and wiped their mouths on linen napkins. Then they rang the bell for more. By the time midnight brushed its cold fingers across the outer stone walls of the manor, the kitchen was still alive. Not in the cozy, hearth-glowing kind of way you might imagine. No, it breathed like a beast too exhausted to die, exhaling smoke, grease, and quiet curses. The fire hadn't been out in days. The hearths smouldered, bones soaked in pots, knives hung loosely on bent nails. And Edric, our bone-tired servant, was wiping a smear of blood, maybe pigeon, maybe his own, off a wooden slab with a cloth that used to be a shirt. In the hours after a feast, there was no victory, no applause, just clean-up, buckets of water hauled in again, this time for scrubbing instead of boiling, animal guts shoveled into pits, crumbs swept, roaches scuttled across countertops like they'd won a war. Edric's legs wobbled with each step. His back screamed louder than the noble's bard, and Mistress Ellen, of course, was still barking orders, as though her lungs ran on mead and brimstone. Here's something most people forget. Cooking for nobility wasn't just about filling bellies. It was about displaying power. A roasted peacock with feathers repinned wasn't dinner, it was propaganda. Look how wealthy I am. Look how many spices I own. Look what animals I can afford to kill for fun. The kitchen was the engine room of the Lord's vanity, and those who toiled inside it weren't chefs. They were stagehands in a theatre where no one clapped. The food was rarely appreciated. At best, it was consumed with absent grunts. At worst, it was tossed back into the hallway with complaints like too salty, too cold, or this pigeon tastes anxious. Ellen once hurled a dripping trencher through the door after a nobleman dared to insult her marrow jelly. "Let's see him do better," she shouted, hurling her ladle like a spear. She was only reprimanded because it hit the steward's dog. Despite her fury, Ellen was a genius. She could identify herbs by scent alone. She could calculate oven timing while drunk, and she carried recipes in her head because parchment was for the literate and the rich. The irony? Her name would never be remembered. Nobles who barely knew how to crack an egg would have their titles etched in stone. Ellen would be buried nameless, hands curled from years of gripping hot iron. The same fate awaited everyone in that kitchen. Not because they lack skill, but because history doesn't record those who feed it. Edric once asked Ellen if she missed life before service. She stared into a pot of tripe for a moment and said, "Life before this, that was hunger without purpose. Now it's just hunger with a schedule." Then she went back to slicing turnips. Sanitation? Barely. Health codes? A dream from the future. Raw meat and vegetables mingled. Rats were as common as spoons, and if someone fell sick, they didn't stop cooking. they just used their sleeve more often. The noble table might glitter with imported silver, but it was served by hands covered in soot and the occasional scab. Let's talk about water. Clean water was harder to find than good pay. It had to be drawn from wells, sometimes far from the manor. It was often murky, crawling with things that shouldn't crawl. So most liquids were boiled. Stews, soups, pottages, thick, hot, safe, usual. But during summer, when meat spoiled faster and water turned rank, the risk of poisoning the noble family grew. That's when scapegoats were selected in advance. If someone got sick, blame the kitchen boy. If someone died, blame the kitchen boy twice. The servants knew this. So did Edric. You didn't just cook. You prepared your defense. You made sure someone else stirred the questionable pot. You left out herbs that could balance humors. You offered prayers over dishes, not for holiness, but for protection from blame. And still, accidents happened. Ellen had once worked at a different manor, where the lord choked on an almond. His widow claimed it was sabotage. The entire kitchen staff was dismissed. 3 were whipped, 1 vanished. No investigation, just grief, fury, and punishment. Almonds were banned in this kitchen ever since. Not for allergy, for politics. And yet, despite all this, the injuries, the accusations, the back-breaking labor, the kitchen had a pulse of strange loyalty. Maybe it was the fire, the constant need to work as a team, the shared exhaustion. Or maybe it was because misery is less miserable when it's distributed. Jokes still happened. Quiet songs were hummed. Flour was occasionally tossed in jest. One night, during a lull, Edric carved a tiny face into a carrot and set it dancing on a fork. For a full minute, even Ellen laughed, but the laughter didn't last. It never did. Not in a place where you were always a broken dish away from starvation. Not in a kitchen that smelled of onions and mortality. Not when your entire purpose was to feed those who would never ask your name. As dawn crept near, Edric collapsed beside the hearth, too tired to even eat the crust of bread he'd pocketed. The fires still glowed. Ellen slumped against a barrel, head nodding. The others curled up like cats, finding warmth where they could. No bed, no blanket, just stone and soot, and the satisfaction that for now they had survived the Lord's appetite. Because in the medieval kitchen, that was the only victory that mattered, not dying today. Chapter 5: Forbidden Rooms and Whispered Secrets. For most medieval servants, the grand rooms of the manor was something they cleaned, but never truly entered. They existed in those spaces like ghosts, silent, invisible, and not meant to be remembered. The tapestries they dusted, the candelabras they polished, the rugs they beat, all were glimpsed from the floor, never from comfort. These were the forbidden rooms, the sanctified domains of people who believed upholstery had more worth than the hands that maintained it. Edric, like most, knew the manor's layout better than the Lord himself. He could navigate its corridors in darkness. He knew which doors creaked, which rugs hid warped planks, and where the mold always returned no matter how many times you scrubbed it with lye. And yet, for all his familiarity, there were places he was never supposed to step inside. The solar, the master's study, the ladies' private chambers. These were places for people with names that came with land. But the thing about forbidden places is they draw attention, especially when the people who use them are so careless with their secrets. Take the solar, for instance, a sunny upper room used for leisure, embroidery, and the occasional game of chess between nobles pretending they weren't plotting. Servants were allowed to clean it, but only when no one was there. It held books, precious, hand-copied volumes, and delicate cushions imported from somewhere vaguely east of understanding. Edric once passed through it to fetch a misplaced goblet, and caught a glimpse of Lady Maud sketching something on parchment. It wasn't flowers, it was a man, shirtless, holding a sword. He never mentioned it. He valued his limbs. Then there was the Lord's study, a place of ledgers, scrolls, and secrets not meant for common eyes. Here, the steward and the master pored over rents, grain tallies, and letters with wax seals that looked suspiciously broken before opening. Marjorie claimed once that she saw the steward pocketing coin from a delivery pouch. Saw it plain, she said while scrubbing a tapestry fringe. Then he gave me wine the next day. Nice wine. Told me to forget what I hadn't seen. She did, mostly, because knowledge among servants was dangerous. If you knew too much, or were suspected of knowing, you became a liability, and in the servant hierarchy, liabilities got reassigned, or dismissed, or sent to help distant cousins on their estate, which was code for never seen again. The safest thing was to know everything, and speak nothing, which ironically made you more valuable. A good servant was a walking archive who kept his mouth shut. The ladies' chambers were sacred ground. Any male servant caught there without permission could be beaten, or worse. Rumors were enough to ruin a life, but female servants weren't safe either. They saw things, heard things, whispers behind doors, late-night visits, broken jewelry, concealed bruises. A kitchen girl once overheard a noblewoman sobbing through a locked door. The next morning, the girl was sent away officially to nurse a sick aunt. She didn't have an aunt, and yet, despite the risk, secrets slipped. Nobles were careless. They whispered loudly. They wrote letters and left them unsealed. They held clandestine meetings near open stairwells. Servants heard everything and passed it down like folklore. Gossip moved faster than fleas, and just like fleas, it bit hard when it landed in the wrong place. Sometimes it was petty. Who was sleeping with whom? Who owed debts? Who had a rash down there? Other times, it was dangerous. Who plotted against the Lord? Who poisoned the wine? Who wanted the cook's job bad enough to burn the bread on purpose? Information became a currency traded quietly between candlelight and cold stone. Edric learned this from Marjorie, who claimed to know where the steward kept his mistress hidden. Third floor, behind the storeroom. Used to be a priest hole, she whispered while wringing out a rag. Now it's for other sins. Was it true? Who knew? But Edric believed her. Marjorie was many things. Bitter, bent, chronically unimpressed. But she wasn't a liar. Sometimes secrets even saved servants. Knowing something valuable could shield you from punishment. The cook once dropped a pie meant for the bishop's visit. Ellen made Edric swear to silence. In return, he got a spare loaf and her word that if he ever needed a favor, she'd remember. That favor later saved him from being flogged for disrespectful chewing. Yes, that was yet, with every whispered truth came a risk. The walls of the manor weren't stone, they were ears. You never knew who repeated what to whom. One wrong word, and your bed would be empty the next morning. Some servants made a game of it, testing what they could say to whom, and how far it would travel. Edric never played. He listened, he remembered, but he never repeated. That was the real art of surviving the manor. Not hard work, not loyalty, but silence. The kind of silence that saw everything, and smiled anyway. That laughed politely when the Lord stumbled drunk out of the library. That nodded when asked if the meat smelled off, when you'd watched it writhe with worms that morning. And through it all, you learned one grim truth. The grander the room, the uglier the secret. Behind every velvet curtain was a confession. Behind every polished door a whisper. And beneath every command was a lie waiting to be overheard. Edric slept near the stairs, in a gap between walls where voices drifted freely. He never meant to become a collector of secrets, but over time they found him anyway. They settled into his bones, because in a world built on hierarchy and silence, the only real power a servant ever had was knowing what no one else dared to say out loud. The manor whispered constantly, not through magic, but through wood and stone, and the soft crack of secrets passed from mouth to ear in the stillness between duties. It wasn't just the grand rooms that held forbidden truths. Every space from pantry to passageway seemed to echo with things not meant to be heard. And if the nobles ever realized how porous their privacy truly was, they'd have torn the walls down themselves. But they didn't, because they assumed servants had no ears, and certainly no memory worth respecting. Edric, ever the quiet observer, had developed what Marjorie half-jokingly called his rat sense, an instinct for when something was being said that wasn't meant to be. Not that he set out to listen, but it's difficult not to hear when someone is shouting behind a half-closed door, or arguing near the bread store. He never wrote anything down that would have been suicide, but he remembered every raised voice, every suspicious absence, every cryptic phrase like it must be handled before Michaelmas, or she cannot be seen like this. There were entire passageways servants used that the lords rarely entered, narrow service corridors behind the great hall, spiral staircases hidden inside wall cavities. Trapped air and torch smoke made these spaces claustrophobic, but they were the lifeblood of the manor's function, and often the very arteries through which gossip flowed. Sometimes Edric would walk from the buttery to the chapel with a tray of bread, and emerge knowing who the steward had yelled at that morning and which guest was leaving early due to sudden illness. Even the manor's architecture betrayed the illusion of noble privacy. Walls were thin, floors creaked, tapestries hid cracks and hollows where sound travelled freely. There was one spot behind the lady's chamber where if you pressed your ear just right you could hear her speaking softly to her maid about the visitor from Kent. Edric never stayed long. That particular secret smelled like scandal, while Juicy had a habit of burning everyone involved. But it wasn't only the nobility hiding things. Servants had their own forbidden pockets of existence, a hidden stash of dried fruit behind the old grain sack, a chipped mirror passed hand to hand, a stolen page from a psalter cherished not for holiness but for its novelty, letters and ink, things most servants would never own. There was a half loft above the laundry room where two kitchen girls would meet after dark, not for mischief, just for 5 minutes of silence together, out of sight, out of duty. Every forbidden room had a counter space, a mirror world below stairs where those same forbidden urges, love, anger, vanity, played out without chandeliers or embroidered cushions. Servants couldn't change the rules, but they bent them quietly in the corners where no one looked. And still there was danger, because if the wrong person caught you in the wrong place, even for the right reasons, consequences followed swiftly. A footman once wandered into the study at night to retrieve a forgotten candle and was accused of rifling through ledgers. He lost a finger. They said it was a warning, the same word they used when a scullery maid was caught near the solar and dismissed with no shoes, no pay, and a bruise on her cheek no one talked about. Not every secret was salacious or dark. Some were simply awkward truths the nobles refused to acknowledge, like how Lord Wulfric's brother owed gambling debts to a merchant from Flanders and had pawned the family crest, or how the lady insisted her dog ate only from silver dishes while half the estate's children were chewing bark. Edric once watched her feed the spaniel buttered pears with her own fingers. Then she told a passing servant to skip dinner as a lesson in self-discipline. Servants saw everything. They saw the nobleman who cried alone in the chapel after a feast. They saw the lady kneeling, not in prayer but because her corset had bruised her ribs. They saw the steward pocketing tithe money while preaching temperance to a weeping tenant. They saw the falsehood of power, how it wore perfume, drank wine and lied with a straight spine and full pocket. And that's why whispered secrets weren't just gossip. They were maps of survival, knowing who was favored, who was fragile, who was furious. That gave a servant the smallest edge. Edric learned to lean on these whispers like a blind man with a cane, not to harm but to avoid being crushed. Marjorie once told him, "The less they think you hear, the more you learn." That's how I've lasted. She was right. She always was. She'd outlasted 4 stewards and 2 fires. She'd seen secrets become scandals, and scandals fade into silences that no one dared break. The great irony? Despite all the secrecy, despite all the hush and hiding, the manor was not a safe place for truth. It was a place where truth had to dress itself in whispers and be passed like contraband. The louder something was declared, the more likely it was a lie. The more forbidden the space, the more likely it held something fragile, pride, shame, or guilt. As Edric lay curled under the pantry shelf one night, the smell of dried leeks above and sour bread below, he listened. A door creaked. A voice murmured. Somewhere someone was confessing, not to a priest but to a peer in confidence they hoped would hold. He didn't move. He didn't cough. He let the secret pass. Because in the world of the medieval servant, hearing was easy. Knowing what not to repeat. That was the difference between waking up in the manor and waking up nowhere at all. Chapter 6. The hidden love lives of the servants. In a manor where duty came before breath, love was a complicated liability. Romantic desire, or anything resembling personal affection, was considered a distraction at best, a scandal at worst. Yet, like ivy on stone, it crept into corners, bloomed in shadows, and clawed its way into the lives of servants who barely had room to sleep, let alone dream. Edric, now older, with eyes more cautious than wide, had learned early that love among servants was not something written in poems. There were no candlelit dinners or walks in meadows. Love, when it existed, was furtive. Glances stolen over water buckets, fingers brushed in passing, an extra crust left on the bench without a word. Affection was not declared, it was implied, whispered, hidden. Take Alice, the baker's niece, pressed into kitchen work last spring. She had laughter that sounded like mischief and a limp from a childhood fever. Edric never spoke more than a few phrases to her in public. It would have drawn attention, but in the back pantry, while stacking bread or scrubbing boards, they shared stories, short ones, about village fairs, about stupid pigs, about the ridiculous way Lord Wulfric shouted, "Bring me pickles," in the middle of sermons. It wasn't love, exactly. It wasn't allowed to become love, but it was something, a softness in a hard place, and for servants, that meant everything. The rules, of course, forbade it. Technically, servants weren't supposed to fraternize. The steward's favourite phrase was "no dalliances below stairs," a phrase he'd mutter while adjusting his belt after emerging from the laundry room. Hypocrisy wasn't just common in the manor, it was furniture. If 2 servants were caught in an embrace, Consequences followed, a warning if you were lucky, dismissal if you were noticed by someone important, public shaming if the rumor reached the Lord's ears. But if a pregnancy occurred, that was disaster. The woman was often blamed entirely, labeled a seductress or a fool. She might be sent away, sometimes to another estate, sometimes to a convent. The man, if identified, might be fined or beaten. But more often than not, he just denied involvement, and the silence swallowed the rest. Alice eventually disappeared. No word, no explanation. Edric asked around. No one admitted to knowing anything. Marjorie simply muttered, "That girl had too much light in her. The manor eats light." After that, Edric didn't ask again. And yet, the desire to connect never vanished. Even in a place built on silence and submission, people felt. Servants didn't cease being human just because they scrubbed chamber pots. They longed for warmth, companionship, understanding. It was forbidden, but so was nearly everything that made life bearable. There were couples who made it work in secret. A stable boy and a scullery maid who met once a week behind the barn. A footman and a dairy girl who communicated through scraps of carved wood. Marjorie, surprisingly, had once been married. He was a cook, could fix a barrel with one hand while swatting flies with the other, she said. Died of rotten teeth. Didn't stop me loving him. That was the most she'd ever shared. Sex among servants was a different kind of secret. It wasn't always gentle, it wasn't always mutual. In a world where everyone was tired, hungry, and pressed against each other in cramped quarters, boundaries blurred. Sometimes it was comfort, sometimes it was coercion, and sometimes, tragically, it was survival. A girl might endure a steward's groping to avoid being reassigned to latrine duty. A boy might let a noblewoman's hand linger longer than it should, because resistance could mean ruin. The church, of course, preached chastity, but it was a sermon of convenience. Lords sinned freely and received forgiveness. Servants sinned quietly and received punishment. A servant girl caught kissing a boy in the orchard was scolded by the priest on Sunday, while the priest himself winked at the miller's daughter every Friday. Despite it all, love found ways to exist, through songs hummed in tandem, through shared blankets during winter shifts, through carved initials hidden on the underside of pantry shelves. Edric once found one, GPM 1349, a plague year. Even then, someone had dared to love while the world fell apart. Love also lived in friendship, often more enduring than romance. The bonds between servants ran deep, forged in shared labor, shared pain, shared contempt for the nobility's nonsense. Edric would never call Marjorie a friend. She would have boxed his ears, but when he once sliced his palm open on a meat hook, she was the first to bind it. "Can't have you bleeding into the flour," she grunted. "You're bad enough company as it is." For many servants, these quiet, fierce alliances were the closest thing to family they'd ever know. Blood relatives were often lost to disease, war, or distance, but the girl who helped you clean a mess before the steward saw it, she was worth more than kin. Still, love in any form came with risk. Every smile, every touch, every whispered word had to be weighed against potential cost. Would it be overheard? Would it be misunderstood? Would it be punished? Edric had once considered slipping a carved token into a girl's apron, a small wooden fox, clumsy, but heartfelt. He kept it for days, waiting for the right moment. But when he heard the steward reprimand another boy for sending notes like a minstrel's idiot, he burned it, not out of fear, out of exhaustion, because in the life of a servant, love wasn't impossible, just expensive. Strange thing about love in a place like the manor was how it lingered. Even after it had been punished, buried, or simply forgotten, it didn't thrive. It didn't bloom, but it clung like soot in a chimney, stubborn and invisible, until something flared and the whole thing smoked. In the quiet hours between tasks, when the fire was down to embers and no one shouted for ale or candles, that was when servants allowed themselves to remember, or hope, or ache. Edric had seen what happened when love broke the unspoken rules. It never ended cleanly. There was Thomas, a footman built like a door, who fell for one of the lady's distant cousins' handmaidens. A travelling party came through the manor during Lent, ironically, a time of restraint, and she stayed only a week. But that was enough. Edric watched as Thomas, a man known more for his fists than his feelings, went from scowls to sighs. The girl left, as they always did, but Thomas kept staring at the staircase she had once descended like it still owed him something. 2 weeks later, he picked a fight with a steward's assistant over spoiled eggs and got himself reassigned to manure carting. No one mentioned the girl again, but Marjorie, ever observant, muttered, "Love makes men dafter than drink," and she had a point. The manor's love stories were rarely happy. They were stitched together from desperation, patched with longing, and often undone by poverty, proximity, or power. Some were transactional. A servant girl might let the stable master visit her corner in exchange for better oats or fewer bruises. Some were protective. Two boys pretending to hate each other in daylight, only to share warmth beneath the stairs when the others were asleep. There was no room for sentimentality, only calculation, but within that calculation lived something heartbreakingly human. The nobility, of course, paraded their romances like banners. Flirtations in public, whispered trysts behind heavy curtains, affairs that everyone saw but no one named. Their indiscretions were poetic, their scandals discreetly silenced with coin or marriage alliances. But a scullery maid found pregnant, that was sin, that was shame, that was cause for dismissal, often without a second thought. Edric had once watched a girl named Bet carried from the manor in the back of a cart, barely conscious, her belongings wrapped in a sheet. No one knew for sure what happened. Rumours bloomed like mould that she'd seduced the under-butler, that she'd refused him, that it was the Lord's cousin. In the end it didn't matter, she was gone. The silence that followed was louder than any verdict. And yet the manor could not stop love entirely. It simply warped it, twisted it into something small, something surviving. Like the couple who carved their initials into the base of the orchard tree where they once met, long since assigned to different ends of the estate, but still glancing toward the trunk as they passed it, as though memory itself might speak. Or the girl who left flowers at the edge of the well every month for whom no one dared ask. There was a bitter poetry in the fact that servants who spent their lives enabling the comforts and romantic games of their masters were so often denied love themselves. Edric had spent whole nights preparing the lady's chamber for her new marriage, only to sleep in the straw with aching knees. He watched nobles exchange rings, while knowing that if he gave a ribbon to a girl he might lose his position. He listened to harp songs played at feasts celebrating courtly love while holding back tears for someone he never got to say goodbye to. And still, even knowing all that, servants tried, they whispered, they waited for the rare nights when duty was done early, and the air smelled more like autumn than ash. Those nights laughter could be heard, tentative, soft, almost dangerous. A boy singing off-key, a girl snorting in amusement before clapping her hands over her mouth. And in those moments the manor was more than a machine. It was a prison where the prisoners wrote secret poems on the walls. Marjorie, as cynical as ever, used to say, "Love's a luxury, like meat, best not to get used to it," but even she softened sometimes. She once let two young maids switch shifts so they could attend the village fair together. "Not that I care," she barked, "just don't burn the linen next time." But Edric saw the way she lingered at the window, watching them go, as if remembering something long buried. Perhaps the truest tragedy wasn't that servant love was punished, it was that it had no place to exist safely. There were no letters exchanged without risk, no gifts without suspicion, no futures promised, just moments, fleeting and fragile. The manor didn't forbid love with laws, it crushed it with silence, with overwork, with fear, and yet it endured, in secret, in memory, in the hope that maybe, just maybe, someone out there would remember your name, even if history did not. Edric would never admit it aloud, but he still thought of Alice, especially when the bread rose just right, when the kitchen smelled of cloves, or when laughter floated too close to memory. He didn't have her ribbon, he didn't have her words, but he had the echo of something that mattered, even in a world that pretended it didn't. Chapter 7. Cleaning the filth of the nobility. Of all the thankless tasks that fell upon the shoulders of a medieval servant, perhaps none were more demoralizing, more physically revolting, and more symbolically revealing than the job of cleaning up after the nobility. Quite literally, cleaning their filth, not in a metaphorical, how tragic the burden of the lower class sort of way, but in the most blunt, unapologetic and pungent sense. Chamber pots, bedclothes, rotten food, fleas, blood, vomit. The manor didn't shine because the nobles were clean, it shone because someone else scrubbed until their hands cracked. Let's not dress it up. The average noble produced filth in quantities that would alarm even modern sanitation crews, and while the great halls may have featured tapestries, oil lamps and imported carpets, their glamour masked a rank underbelly. Behind every polished goblet was a maid who spent hours buffing it with vinegar and wool. Under every fur-lined cloak was a trail of lice left behind for someone else to sweep. And guess who did it? Edric did, Marjorie did, dozens like them did, day after day, without thanks or acknowledgement. The phrase "below stairs" wasn't just geographic, it was social reality. The deeper you went, the dirtier it got. Let's start with the chamber pots, those innocent-looking ceramic basins that every noble kept under their bed or chair. Some were gilded, some were painted. All of them held the same thing, human waste. Nobles didn't go to the outhouse. Why should they? That was for peasants. Instead they relieved themselves in those pots, left them full overnight, and expected them to be emptied every morning without complaint. Heaven forbid a servant forget. Edric once saw a girl get slapped for not emptying Lady Maud's pot fast enough. The girl had been vomiting from illness. The lady didn't care. The pot was emptied into a larger barrel, then carried often sloshing down the stone halls out the side door and dumped into a cesspit or moat. And in winter, the waste sometimes froze, meaning servants had to break it apart with sticks. That's not poetic, that's documented reality. And don't get smug, these nobles weren't bathing often either. A proper bath required hours of heating water, hauling it, pouring it, perfuming it. So most nobles preferred to mask their odors with herbs, oils, or by blaming the servants for bringing in smells. They wore the same undergarments for days, the same linens, the same cloaks, thick with sweat and occasionally lice. Servants were responsible for washing these clothes, often by stomping them in barrels of lye water or beating them on rocks. A servant's knuckles turned red, their skin peeled, and infections were common. But the linen gleamed, so the lady could comment how fresh she felt after changing into it. Beds? Noble beds were monstrous things, layered with furs, stuffed with feathers, lined with heavy drapes. They were also breeding grounds for lice, fleas, and the occasional rodent. Servants were tasked with pulling the bedding apart, shaking it outside, and then reassembling it just so. One time, a noble guest awoke with bite marks. The blame? A maid forgot to hang lavender sprigs under the pillow. That girl was reassigned to latrine cleaning. No trial, no explanation, just filth for punishment. Speaking of latrines, not every manor had them. Some had garderobes, basically toilet seats built into castle walls that dumped waste down chutes. Romantic, right? Except someone had to clean the catch basin. That someone was never the law. And then there were feasts. You've heard about the glamour, roasted swans, sugared apples, golden bread. What you don't hear is what was left behind. Bones scattered on the floor, grease smeared into tablecloths, drunken nobles vomiting into corners. Servants cleaned all of it, on hands and knees, with rags made from torn tunics. The floors had to be scrubbed with sand, the air thick with smoke, wine, and decay. Sometimes it wasn't just waste, sometimes it was blood, a hunting accident, a broken goblet, a punishment handed out by the steward or worse, the lord himself. If a servant was flogged, someone still had to mop up the mess afterward. And no, they weren't given extra time. They were told to hurry. Lord Wulfric hated the smell of blood before lunch. There were times Edric genuinely questioned whether he was still a person. When he was kneeling in filth scraping hardened grease from a wall while two noble boys laughed about a dog eating vomit, he felt less than human. He wasn't alone. Every servant had that moment. That flicker of realization that their entire existence was to erase the byproducts of people who didn't know their names. What made it worse was how casually cruelty flowed from the top. Nobles expected servants to enjoy this role, or at least to find dignity in it. Hard work builds character, one knight said while spitting chicken bones onto the floor Edric had just polished. Servants are the backbone of order, as if that poetic nonsense made up for the burns, the stench, or the humiliating scoldings handed out because a boot had mud on it. And the church? Oh, it helped. Occasionally, preachers reminded nobles to be kind. Even the lowly serve God through their labor. That was the official line. Unofficially, the church still sat at the Lord's table and walked past the scullery without once looking inside. The tragedy wasn't just the labor, it was the expectation that servants be proud of it, to smile while scrubbing, to thank their masters for providing them with purpose, as if emptying chamber pots was a privilege, as if being allowed to exist beneath someone else's table was something to cherish. And yet, Edric endured, not because he believed the lie, but because there was no other choice. The rain-slicked cobblestones reflected the dim glow of gas lamps, each puddle a mirror to the changing times. In the distance, a saxophone wailed its lonely song, echoing through alleyways, where Victorian propriety was slowly giving way to modern sensibilities. Every task in a medieval manor reminded you who you were, but none rubbed it in your face quite like cleaning someone else's filth. It wasn't just work, it was a performance of class boundaries, a ritual humiliation that was somehow accepted as the natural order of things. Servants were expected to be invisible during mealtime, silent during ceremonies, and remarkably efficient when it came to mopping up bodily fluids. If they hesitated, even for a second, someone above them made sure they remembered their place, usually with a sneer, sometimes with a cuff to the head. Edric had come to recognize the smell of every room before he entered it. Not just the scent of herbs or smoke, but what rot lay beneath. The buttery reeked of spilled ale, the solar smelled of dust and perfume. The lady's chamber, when she was unwell, smelled of bile masked by rosewater, and the lord's hunting chamber, after a long day with the hounds and too much wine, smelled like a boar's backside dipped in cheap cologne. But it was Edric's job to wipe it all clean, nod politely, and act like the stink came from nowhere at all. There was no polite way to clean vomit off a carved oak chair, no glamorous technique for picking leeches off a nobleman's bathwater before pouring it out, and yet, this was the daily grind. The manor may have dazzled visitors with its banners and chandeliers, but behind each candlelit corridor lay a trail of sweat, spittle, and waste, and every trail ended with a servant. One of the worst chores, as far as Edric was concerned, was scrubbing privy trenches, long, shallow pits, filled with the output of dozens of people and very little drainage. You'd think after a few weeks the stench would stop bothering you. It didn't. It just became part of the air you breathed, the kind of smell that clung to your hair, soaked into your tunic, and made your bread taste faintly of despair. In winter, when the filth froze into grotesque sculptures, the work was somehow harder. You had to hack at it with shovels. In summer, it baked. The heat turned every latrine into a sauna of suffering. Once, a servant boy fell into the trench behind the stable. He came out slick with things no one dared name, and was laughed at by the steward. "Wash him, then flog him," he said, for being clumsy. Then there were the noble pets, overfed dogs, cats, falcons, even a goat once, who were given beds while their caretakers slept on straw. These animals fouled halls, scratched tapestries, chewed shoes, and occasionally relieved themselves in firewood bins. Servants cleaned it all, of course, and if the lord's favourite hound happened to bite you while you scrubbed its mess, you apologised to it. Edric still had the scar from a spaniel bite. He had bent too close to its bowl while sweeping under a bench. The lady cooed over the dog's upset nerves, and made Edric sleep outside for a week, to teach him humility. Humility, as it turned out, was damp, cold, and full of mosquitoes. Despite all this, some fools clung to the idea that servant work had its rewards. "At least you eat," said the priest once, while chewing roast duck beside the steward. "God values your labour." Edric wasn't so sure. If God valued labour, he had a strange way of showing it, mainly by letting those who did the least command those who did the most. Let's not forget laundry, a special circle of medieval hell. Clothes were rarely changed but had to be scrubbed when they were, and it was never simple. Boil the water, add lye, beat the garments with paddles, rinse in freezing streams, dry over smoking fires, and hope the Lord didn't complain about the stiffness of his undershirt, despite it having been steeped in 3 days' worth of sweat and whatever perfume he had spilled on himself trying to impress a visiting widow. The washing area was a pit of damp misery. It was slippery, always cold, and smelled like wet dog, mouldy bread, and something indefinable, something human and old and tired. Marjorie ruled this realm. She called the lye tub her baptismal font, and claimed each shirt she scrubbed stole a year from her life. By that math she should have been dead thrice over, and yet she persisted, hands red and raw, scolding anyone who dared fold a tunic incorrectly. Servants invented little rituals to cope. Some sang songs while scrubbing, others whispered curses in Latin. One boy claimed spitting in the hearth before cleaning chamber pots brought good luck. Another swore by chewing mint leaves to keep from gagging. Edric did none of these. He simply counted. Swipes of the rag, steps to the dump pit, drops of wax to remove from floors. It made things feel like they had an end, even if they didn't. The nobility, meanwhile, continued their oblivious parade. They hosted guests. They laughed. They spilled wine and pretended not to notice. A nobleman once urinated in the corner of the hall during a feast, too drunk to stand, then mocked the servant who came to clean it up. "Ah, see how loyal they are," he slurred, "even to my bladder." The room laughed. Edric didn't. Neither did the girl with the mop. Still, the cleaning never stopped. It was eternal, because filth wasn't an accident, it was expected. Nobles didn't see it as shameful, they saw it as proof of their status. They were above dirt not because they were clean, but because someone else made it disappear. That was the real insult. Not the stink, not the exhaustion, but the fact that you weren't just made to clean it, you were made to believe you were born to, and if that wasn't filth, Edric thought what was. Chapter 8. The Price of Disobedience. Obedience was not just expected in a medieval manor. It was mandatory, absolute, and enforced with a precision that made the sharpest kitchen knives seem forgiving. Disobedience, no matter how slight, no matter how justified, came with a price. Sometimes that price was public shame, sometimes it was bruises. and sometimes it was your place in the only world that kept you alive. For a servant like Edric, obedience wasn't a virtue, it was a survival strategy. You learned to nod before the full order was given. You moved before the bell finished ringing. You apologized when you hadn't erred, just in case someone thought you had. To hesitate was to invite suspicion. To question was to court disaster. And yet, mistakes happened. Commands were misheard. Tasks were forgotten in the exhaustion of endless labor. Tempers flared, and when that happened, punishment arrived swiftly, not to correct, but to reinforce the hierarchy. Let's begin with the mildest of punishments. Public scolding, delivered loudly with as many witnesses as possible. These tongue lashings were designed to break spirits while maintaining plausible deniability of cruelty. The steward, with his puffy chest and perpetual sneer, was a master of this. He once berated a boy for dropping a plate by comparing him to a blind goat dancing in a thunderstorm. Everyone laughed. The boy didn't. He cried in the stables that night, and the next day he worked twice as hard without speaking. Then came fines. For paid servants, the few that received coin, having your wages docked meant choosing between food and warmth. Edric once lost a week's pay because the lady claimed her rosewater had been tainted by handling. She couldn't prove it, of course, but that didn't matter. Her discomfort was evidence enough. The steward delivered the verdict with a smirk and told Edric to pray harder for discipline. Fines hurt, but physical punishment was worse. Beatings were common, not officially sanctioned but tolerated so long as they didn't kill. Lords had the legal right to discipline their servants. Reasonable chastisement was the phrase, though no one ever defined what reasonable meant. Was it reasonable to strike a scullery girl for serving stew that was too hot? Lord Wulfric thought so. Was it reasonable to whip a stable boy for falling asleep after working 20 hours? The steward certainly believed it. Marjorie had a crooked finger from having it slammed in a chest lid, accidentally, after speaking too plainly to the under-butler. She wore the deformity like a badge of bitter honor, wagging it whenever she scolded others. "This is what happens when your tongue outruns your caution," she'd say, then spit into the hearth. And then there was reassignment, a quiet punishment often worse than shouting or bruises. You might be moved from kitchen duty to the midden, the waste pits, from bed turning to rat catching. No explanation, just a new task, nastier than the last. The message was clear: know your place, or we'll show you worse places. Some punishments were purely psychological. A servant might be ignored for days. No orders, no eye contact, just cold silence. It sounds mild, but in a world where your identity was tied to your usefulness, being ignored was a form of erasure. Edric endured this once. After accidentally using the wrong cloth on the steward's pewter, he was sent to work in the outer gardens. Forbidden from entering the manor, he ate alone, slept in the tool shed. No one spoke to him. He returned 2 weeks later, quieter than before. And of course there was dismissal, the final punishment. No hearing, no appeal. You were told to pack and leave, sometimes without your final wages, sometimes without shoes. In winter that meant death. Edric had watched it happen to a girl named Lean who spilled ink on a letter from the bishop. She was gone by morning. No goodbyes, no trail, just her name, whispered once or twice, then forgotten. Some servants tried to push back. A stable hand once yelled at the steward, calling him a coward in front of 2 other staff. The steward laughed, then had him locked in the storage cellar for 3 days. When he emerged, thin and shaking, he apologized. Not because he meant it, because he wanted. Resistance didn't lead to revolution. It led to punishment, and that's why most servants never tried. They obeyed not because they believed the system was fair, but because they had no power to change it. They were trapped by lack of land, lack of family, lack of option. And the manor, for all its cruelty, at least offered routine, even if that routine included fear. Yet, there was always a line, a moment where obedience became unbearable. Edric had felt it once when the lord, drunk on claret, tried to force a kitchen girl to entertain a visiting cousin. The girl refused. She was beaten. Edric said nothing, but that night, he left the wine cellar unlocked. The steward's stores were mysteriously spoiled the next morning. No one ever knew who did it, or perhaps everyone did, but no one spoke, because sometimes, disobedience wasn't shouted, it was whispered, carried out with subtlety, a broken clasp here, a delay there, a dish served cold. These were the rebellions servants could afford. Quiet, private acts of resistance in a world that punished noise. There was no ceremony to punishment in the manor. No fairness. No explanations carved in parchment. Only the bruised logic of power, where nobility didn't need proof. Only displeasure. Disobedience, even if justified, even if accidental, was like a shadow on your back, invisible to the nobles, but heavy enough to break you. For the lowest servants, even appearing insolent was enough. If Edric furrowed his brow too long while receiving a command, that could be read as resistance. If he looked tired, just tired, it might be seen as laziness. There was no space for ambiguity. You were either obedient, or you were proving you weren't, and in a house run by moods and murmurings, that proof was always waiting to be found. Some lords, like Wulfric, didn't need a reason. Punishment was a performance, a way of reminding everyone of their rank. He once ordered a stable boy flogged for not doffing his cap quickly enough during a ride past the chapel. The boy didn't even see him coming. That didn't matter. The punishment wasn't for him. It was for everyone else. A theatre of control, staged to thunderous silence. And when things went wrong, when a pot broke, when a horse got lame, when a meal ran late, someone had to blame. In the manor was a game of hot bread passed around until it landed in the coldest hands. The nobles never held it. The steward rarely did. It always ended with someone like Edric. Palms out, head bowed, hoping the day's wrath wouldn't sting too badly. But physical pain wasn't the only weapon. Fear was more efficient. A glance from the steward, a tap of his cane against the wall, a whisper from the under-butler. These things could unravel a servant's peace faster than a blow. Edric had once spent 3 nights sleepless after being told the Lord had questions about his performance. The questions never came, but the message was clear. You are always being watched. And perhaps worse than punishment was the feeling of being set up for it. Sometimes tasks were impossible, on purpose. Clean this floor spotless in 1 hour, even though it's covered in wax and soot. Prepare a feast with supplies that don't exist. Polish silver that was bent and rusted from before you were born. These were traps. The purpose wasn't success. The purpose was submission. Still, there were moments when the line between servant and victim blurred into something more dangerous, scapegoating. When the lady's brooch went missing during a visit from the bishop, no one accused a guest. No one questioned the noble cousins. The blame fell on a maid barely old enough to hold a broom. She wept and swore innocence. They searched her things, found nothing, dismissed her anyway. Can't be too careful, the steward said. She had nowhere to go. Servants began to learn that silence was not just obedience, it was armor. You kept your thoughts folded, your opinions buried. You didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't react unless permitted. The manor rewarded the quiet, the careful, the invisible. Edric became a master of nodding without agreeing, of looking without seeming to look. He survived because he learned to appear obedient, even when his thoughts rebelled loudly inside his skull. Yet rebellion did exist, not loud, not proud, but practical. A cracked pitcher hidden instead of reported, a slice of bread quietly taken when no one watched, an insult mumbled under breath while sweeping the Lord's stables. These were the rebellions of the weak, small, harmless and utterly necessary, because without them, the crushing weight of the manor would erase everything that made you human. Some pushed further. A kitchen boy once spat in the wine before a feast, a secret revenge against a knight who'd kicked him for dropping a spoon. The knight drank, nothing happened. The boy grinned for weeks, until someone told no one admitted who. He was gone by dawn. They said he was sent to another estate. More likely, he was left at the town edge with a coin and a curse. Marjorie, old enough to have seen these stories repeat, had her own rules. Don't speak when you're angry. Don't look them in the eye. Don't cry until they leave the room. She had been punished once, years ago, for telling a visiting priest that the chapel floors wouldn't scrub themselves. He told the Lord she had mocked the holy office. She wasn't allowed in the manor for 2 months. Worked the garden alone, in rain, in frost. She never said a sarcastic word in earshot again, unless it was to another servant. And what of those who simply refused? The rare ones who said no. The girl who ran from the kitchen after being told to serve wine to a man who had once grabbed her. The boy who wouldn't clean blood off a whip. They were brave, maybe even right, but they disappeared, and in the manor's memory, short and selective, they never existed. It wasn't all brutality, of course. That's the lie the system told best. Most days punishments didn't happen. Most tasks were done, but that's exactly how the control worked. The threat loomed, constant, like a knife above a sleeping body. It didn't need to cut to shape behavior. It only needed to exist. Edric had never been whipped, not yet, but he'd scrubbed floors shaking with fear. He'd whispered prayers to saints he didn't believe in. He'd watched others be punished and wondered when it would be his turn. Because in the manor, the only real rule was this: eventually everyone gets their due, unless of course they learn to disappear before it comes. Chapter 9. When war reaches the manor walls. For the average medieval servant, war was not a battlefield miles away, romanticized in tales of banners and glory. It was a creeping shadow that slipped past the hedgerows and over stone walls, bringing with it smoke, fear and the stench of death, dressed in armor. And when war came close, when it knocked, or worse, didn't knock, the manor changed. It tightened. It shifted into something colder, hungrier, and infinitely more dangerous. Edric remembered the first time he saw soldiers enter the manor courtyard. They didn't storm the gates. They didn't shout. They arrived like rain, sudden, wet, and unwelcome. Dusty cloaks, dented helms, faces streaked with dried sweat and half-healed wounds. They weren't invaders. They were the king's men, allies, and yet they brought more chaos than a month of bad harvest. They came for requisitioning, which was a poetic way of saying they took whatever they wanted: chickens, grain, candles, boots. In the name of the crown, they said, as they pulled bread from ovens and loaded it into carts. The steward bowed. The lord nodded solemnly. The servants gritted their teeth. There was no protest. To protest a soldier was to risk more than your meal. Some soldiers stayed, quartered in the manor's upper rooms, or in the stables if the lord wasn't particularly generous. And soldiers brought swords, and swords brought danger. Edric learned quickly to avoid eye contact with men who laughed too hard, drank too fast, and looked at servant girls too long. The manor, already tense, became something worse: a powder keg. Marjorie said war was like rats in the pantry. You don't see the mess until after they've chewed through everything. She wasn't wrong. The kitchen had to stretch meals thinner, blankets were borrowed, tools went missing, and the soldiers didn't care whose broom they stepped on or whose sleep they shattered. They weren't cruel, not always, just entitled, trained to believe that survival gave them every right. Then came the conscription notices, rolled parchment stamped with the king's seal and posted in the chapel. Any able-bodied man could be taken to serve. Edric wasn't noble, he wasn't a tradesman, he had no coin to pay for exemption. Only the steward's insistence that he was too useful to the household spared him. Others weren't so lucky. 2 stable boys, a baker's son, the youngest porter who hadn't yet learned to tie his apron. They were taken with promises of coin and honor. No one saw them again. The manor itself began to feel like a fortress, not a strong one, just a place waiting to be tested. Watchmen were doubled. Stores were hidden. The steward barked orders with more edge. The lord's sword was polished twice a day, though no one had ever seen him swing it. There were whispers of nearby raids, bandits disguised as rebels, rebels disguised as saviors. Truth became rumor, and rumor became fear. Servants suffered first. When food ran low, they got less. When tempers flared, they took the blame. Edric once served wine to a visiting captain who muttered, "Nothing like a warm hall to make you forget the dead." Then he dropped the goblet and punched the wall. The goblet shattered. Edric was fined for clumsiness. That winter, the manor grew colder, not just in temperature, but in mood. Doors slammed harder. Words came sharper. Every knock on the gate made hearts jump. A peddler arrived one morning with tales of villages burned for sheltering deserters. The lord turned him away. That night, the steward quietly ordered all outer gates locked, not for protection, but to avoid hospitality. Servants talked in whispers. What if the war came here? Not soldiers asking for bread, but raiders with torches. What if the manor burned? Who would save them? The lord, hiding behind his walls. The steward who never missed a chance to remind them they were privileged to serve. Edric didn't know, but he sharpened a stick and hid it under his bedding, just in case. And then, as quickly as they arrived, the soldiers left. Off to the next manor, off to the next skirmish. They took their stories, their lice, and 3 of the manor's hounds with them. The halls echoed emptier for days. The steward walked with a limp no one explained. One of the chambermaids refused to leave her room. Marjorie cleaned blood off a doorframe without speaking. But war didn't leave when the soldiers did. It lingered. In the broken tools, the stolen food, the haunted faces, the knowledge that peace, if it existed at all, could be shattered by hoofbeats and flags you didn't recognize. And it changed the servants, not in loud ways, but in the way they looked at the gates, in the way they listened to distant thunder, in the way they learned that in times of war, they were never citizens, only bodies to be used, blamed, or forgotten. The lord held a feast 2 weeks later, celebrating the manor's service to the realm. There were candles, roasted meat, music. Edric served wine. He smiled, he bowed, but his eyes drifted to the window, and he watched, because now he knew what it meant when war was near. When war moved on from a place like the manor, it didn't vanish. It simply took off its boots and left its mud behind. For weeks, sometimes months, the servants would be picking up after it. Not just the broken furniture, the spoiled food, the missing tools, but the silence that came with it. A heavy, swollen silence that filled the gaps between footfalls and haunted every creaking hinge. War never really left, it just paused. Edric noticed it most in the stables. The horses had returned to skittishness. They flinched at loud noises, refused reins, chewed wood. They were prey animals, and war had passed through them like it did through people, bluntly and without apology. One mare had been taken by a passing company of riders. Lord Wulfric had made a scene over it, not because he cared about the mare, but because it had been a gift from a cousin, whose favour he now feared losing. The loss of that horse did more to sour the Lord's mood than any missing servant ever could. Among the servants, a subtle shift had taken root. Trust had thinned. The manor had been a pressure cooker before, but now it simmered constantly. No one knew who had spoken to the soldiers. No one admitted who warned them of hidden grain stores. A loaf had gone missing one night, and the steward had questioned 5 people, harshly. Edric hadn't taken it, but it didn't matter. His back ached for 3 days from the punishment anyway, and worse than bruises was the knowledge that servants had turned on each other. Maybe it was fear, maybe hunger, maybe survival, but someone had whispered a name, and in the manor, a whispered name was often a sentence. Marjorie, who had always been a reliable cynic, grew quieter. She still worked. No one survived as long as she had by slowing down, but her muttering faded. She no longer commented on the stew's thinness, or the ladies' absurd gowns. Edric once asked if she was all right, and she simply looked at him for a long time and said, "I've seen what happens when boys believe war doesn't change the kitchen." It was a nonsense sentence, and yet, perfectly clear. The steward grew crueler, not louder, his punishments more refined. No more shouting, just a subtle nod to the lesser punishments that followed. Double duties, bad food, cold sleeping quarters. One girl was made to haul water alone for 3 days. Her hands bled. When asked why, the steward shrugged. She hesitated when I gave her orders. Fear was the new uniform. It clung tighter than any tunic. You wore it to sleep, to eat, to pray, and yet, through that fear, a few flickers of resistance bloomed. Edric had noticed the kitchen scraps started going missing, but not to rats. Someone was feeding someone else, a sick servant, hidden perhaps, or someone dismissed and still lingering. No one said anything, because everyone knew one kind act might get you punished, but pretending not to see it, that was the only kindness they had left to give. And then came the letters. Riders bearing scrolls with red wax, news of battles, victories, losses. The Lord read them aloud in the great hall like they were songs. "The king has triumphed in the north," he declared once, mouth full of roast. "God is with us." No servant celebrated, they just cleaned up afterward. Some of the Lord's guests brought their own horrors, noblemen who had fought, or claimed to. They boasted over wine about sieges, about villages put to the sword, about deserters hanged. Edric listened while pouring ale, absorbing every gruesome detail. One knight laughed about stealing boots off a dead farmer. Another bragged of disciplining a peasant woman who talked too much. It was during one of those evenings that Edric understood the truth. War was not a disruption to the nobility. It was entertainment, a theatre in which they could play at valor, earn titles, claim land. The cost, lives, homes, servants, was always someone else's to pay. And for those left behind, like Edric, war meant fewer hands to share the same work, more mouths asking for less food, and the ever-present anxiety that it might return not with flags and horns, but with fire and steel, because it had once, and it could again. That spring, one of the missing conscripts came limping back. His name was Rafe, a stable boy who had vanished months earlier, dragged away by a recruiter with a smile and a promise. He returned with a shattered leg, and a silence that made your skin crawl. He spoke only once. "We buried more boys than we fought men." The Lord refused him entry, said he was no longer on the rolls. The steward predictably agreed, so Rafe slept by the edge of the manor pond for 2 nights. On the 3rd morning, he was gone again, whether by road or by water, no one knew. But Edric noticed a faint blood smear on a tree root. He never mentioned it. That's how war ended in the manor, not with victory, but with scars no one acknowledged. It didn't end with banners waving. It ended with servants cleaning blood off the walls, patching holes in roofs, pretending not to remember the faces that hadn't come back. And in the kitchens, the stables, the laundry, the silence remained, because war may have left the manor, but it had made a home in the people it didn't kill. Chapter 10. A rare feast, a brief joy. In the manor, feasts were explosions of noise, waste, and theatre. They arrived not with warning, but with command. A noble guest, visiting. A marriage announced. a saint's day declared suddenly important, and when they came, the entire rhythm of servant life shattered. Normal duties were pushed aside, sleep disappeared, and every muscle, every ounce of energy was redirected toward feeding the gluttonous theatre of the noble class. To the outside eye, a feast looked like celebration, shining goblets, music in the hall, tables buckling under the weight of food. But for the servants, a feast was a battle without weapons. It demanded endurance, timing, perfection. It demanded sweat, it demanded silence, and at the very end, it demanded that you vanish, just in time for the applause you'd never receive. Edric had been through 5 major feasts since entering the manor. Each one left him with new burns, new scars, and new doubts about whether the nobility knew what gratitude even sounded like. This one, held in honor of Lord Wulfric's visiting cousin, a baron from the south, with suspiciously dyed hair and teeth that gleamed more than the silverware, was no exception. Preparations began 3 days early. Every servant was pulled from their usual task. Laundry girls plucked geese, scullery boys turned spits, the steward drafted a seating chart like it was a war campaign. The cook, not Ellen this time, but her sharper younger understudy Tybalt, a man who smelled perpetually of cloves and threats, took over the kitchen like a warlord. He demanded silence. He demanded order. He threw a ladle at a page for bringing turnips instead of carrots. It struck the boy in the ear. No one apologized. The feast required 43 separate dishes. Some had names Edric couldn't pronounce, made with ingredients they barely had. Pastries shaped like castles, eels boiled in spiced wine, birds reassembled after roasting with feathers, repinned to appear alive. It was absurd, but no one called it that. They called it art. They called it honor. They called it showing our southern cousin how cultured we are. And through it all, the servants worked. They scrubbed pans blackened beyond recognition. They boiled honey until it stuck to the walls. They flinched when the steward stormed through, inspecting garnishes, as if parsley placement were a holy rite. One girl fainted after standing 14 hours straight in the kitchen heat. She was dragged outside and told to lie near the pigs until she came to. Tybalt said, "They breathe the same, anyhow." The day of the feast, the manor transformed. Tapestries were dusted, rushes changed, dogs were chained far from the hall. The air smelled of roast and desperation. Servants in cleaner tunics hovered behind curtains. Every face was strained into stillness, and then the guests arrived, velveted, perfumed, loud. They laughed. They tore bread with soft hands and mouths, slick with fat. Edric served near the dais, jug in hand, eyes lowered. He poured wine when signalled, wiped spills before they dripped. He moved like furniture. At one point a noble knocked over a plate. It shattered. He laughed. "Let the dog lick it up," he said, then added, "or the servant." The guests roared. Edric smiled. It was required, but for all the cruelty, for all the labour, there was still a strange magic to these feasts, not in the hall but below it. After the guests retired, after the music stopped, after the nobles had staggered to their chambers or passed out by the fire, the leftovers descended, trays of meat, baskets of bread, flagons half full, and for one brief hour, the servants ate like kings. It was the only time in the year that Edric tasted spiced lamb, or almond cakes, or fresh pears, soaked in cinnamon wine. The scullery boys chewed noisily, the laundresses sang off-key. Even Tybalt, his threat spent, allowed himself a seat near the hearth, and a grim nod of approval. There was laughter, not much, but real. Someone did an impression of the Baron choking on a cherry pit. Even Marjorie snorted, and covered her mouth too late. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was the closest thing they got. A moment of relief, a reminder that beneath the rags and rules, they still had mouths that smiled and bellies that wanted more than gruel. But like all good things in the manor, it ended quickly. The steward made his rounds at dawn. Anyone caught sleeping too near the feast scraps was scolded. The kitchen had to be scrubbed, the pans polished, the evidence of joy erased before the lord's boots hit the floor. And just like that, the silence returned. Edric carried a bruised pear back to his corner behind the stables. He bit into it slowly, tasting spice and rot, sweetness and sour, all at once. That, he thought, was what a feast really was. A bite of something rare and dangerous, sweet on the tongue, and sick in the gut. It wouldn't come again soon, but it had come, and that was more than most things in his life ever did. The morning after a feast in the manor was a different kind of battlefield. Not loud, not bloody, but filled with the quiet casualties of exhaustion and excess. Where the great hall had roared with laughter the night before, now only a few dying embers remained. A spilled goblet, crumbs scattered like confetti, a crushed ribbon lying limp beneath the dais like a forgotten guest, and rising through it all, the weary shuffle of servants reclaiming the space. For Edric, the aftermath always brought a strange clarity. He preferred the post-feast cleanup to the feast itself. At least now, no one was watching. No one was shouting orders or pretending he wasn't there. Now, it was just the work, simple, brutal, honest. He moved between tables, collecting plates still sticky with congealed fat, scraping bones into a bucket for the hounds. The candle wax on the rushes had hardened into pale puddles. His knees cracked when he knelt. His fingers ached, but he welcomed the silence. There was a hierarchy to the leftovers, of course. What the nobles didn't eat was first offered to the steward and upper servants, then to the kitchen workers, then, if anything remained, to the rest. Edric was somewhere in between, senior enough to get a cold joint of mutton, junior enough to eat it standing. Still, he was grateful. Hunger taught gratitude, whether you liked it or not. That morning, he shared a crust with Bren, a quiet boy from the gardens, who barely spoke but smiled when he did. They sat behind the tool shed, backs to the wall, watching the grey sky shift over the frost-covered fields. Bren offered Edric a bite of stewed plum he'd smuggled from the high table's leftovers. Still sweet, he said, as if surprised by the idea that sweetness could survive a night in this place. That was the strange thing about feasts. They were built for someone else's memory. The nobles would remember the swan, the music, the embroidered napkins, but the servants, they remembered the bruises, the steam burns, the blister that burst mid-tray lift. And sometimes, if they were lucky, they remembered a moment, a taste, a glance, a laugh that didn't feel like a betrayal. Marjorie, ever the realist, reminded them what came next. 1 day of meat, 6 days of marrow, she said, hauling a bucket of dishwater like it owed her money. She'd already taken down the feast day banners and folded the linens for reuse. Reuse being a generous term, many had wine stains that no amount of lye would remove. Let them sit on their own gluttony, she grumbled. Might remind them who washed their backsides yesterday. And yet, she too lingered a moment longer than usual, when passing the dessert trays. Edric noticed. He didn't say a word. There was an unspoken rule after a feast. Don't talk about the good parts. To do so was to admit you wanted them, that you missed them, that you needed them. And in the world of servants, need was a dangerous thing. It made you vulnerable. It made you human in a system that rewarded endurance over emotion. So instead they told jokes, dry ones, sarcastic barbs about the noble woman who sang off-key or the knight who fell asleep mid-toast. They mocked the ridiculous hats, the perfume that smelled like boiled onions, the noble who called pheasant chicken with a title. The jokes weren't about rebellion, they were about survival, letting out steam before it turned inward. Because after the feast came the reckoning, not just in cleanup, but in tallies and punishments. The steward would count the goblets, check the pantry stocks, question every missing wedge of cheese. Accusations flew faster after feasts. Too many hands in the stew pot, too many excuses. One boy, no older than 12, was beaten for supposedly stealing a honey tart. He hadn't. Tybalt had eaten it and forgotten. No apology followed. Servants learned quickly. During the feast, you serve. After the feast, you disappear. Still, there was something undeniably binding about these moments. A feast reminded the servants of their shared existence. How they moved like clockwork under pressure, how they whispered warnings down the line. Don't let that plate tilt. She's in a mood today. Don't step near the dog. It's been fed pig's liver. That unity, however forced, was a rare kind of strength. Edric once saw Tybalt, normally too proud to speak to anyone beneath him, silently wrap a burned girl's hand with cloth dipped in milk. He didn't speak, just nodded, and returned to stirring his pot. That was the closest thing to affection the kitchen ever saw. And as the manor returned to its regular pace, its dull churn of chores and murmured obedience, the feast became a memory, not quite joyful, not quite bitter, a strange in-between. Chapter 11. Growing old without a name. In a medieval manor, aging was not a passage of wisdom or reverence. It was a slow erasure, a gentle fading of usefulness, followed by the not-so-gentle question, why are you still here? For nobles, growing old meant becoming a patriarch, a matriarch, a venerable figure, carved into tapestries and remembered in records. For servants, it meant becoming a pair of creaking knees and a name no one bothered to speak aloud anymore. Marjorie had lasted longer than most. She had been in the manor since before Edric was born. Since before the previous lord even. She claimed she had once scrubbed blood from the walls after a wedding gone wrong. Brides stabbed the groom with a hairpin, she whispered, half proud, half mocking. Still served the pudding. No one knew how much of what she said was true, but no one questioned her either. She walked like she owned the stone beneath her feet, and perhaps she did in some quiet way. But even Marjorie, for all her endurance, had started to fade. She moved slower now, her fingers curled in the cold. She muttered more often than she spoke, and her eyes stared too long at empty corners. The steward, once slightly afraid of her tongue, now ignored her entirely. That was how you knew a servant had begun to age out. Not when they were punished, but when they were forgotten. There were no retirement plans for servants, no pensions, no cozy chairs by the fire. When your hands could no longer scrub, when your legs could no longer lift, you simply stopped being useful. And in the logic of the manor, uselessness was close to sin. Edric had seen what happened. First you were assigned easier tasks, sweeping instead of lifting, watching instead of doing. Then you were reassigned to corners of the estate, gardening, sorting kindling, minding chickens. Finally you were told to rest more, which sounded kind but meant stay out of the way. And then, you were simply not mentioned again. Meals came later, requests stopped. One morning you'd wake to find someone else folding the laundry, someone else at your old post. No announcement, no ceremony, just replacement, quiet, efficient, devastating. Some aged servants were sent away to family, they said, or to quieter duties, but no one ever saw where. The manor didn't bury its old, it misplaced them. Edric feared that most, not death but disappearance, to spend a life working, kneeling, lifting, serving, and then vanish without witness, to die unnamed, unmissed, unmarked, a ghost without a haunting. He'd seen old Tomlin, the gate porter, walk with a cane for weeks before being dismissed. One day he fell asleep on the bench. The steward called it sloth. He was gone by evening. Later Edric found his walking stick tossed into the wood pile. He took it and hid it behind the pantry, unsure why. Maybe because it was proof that Tomlin had existed. Even worse was when aging came without warning. Illness was swift, bones broke and never healed, coughs lingered, eyes dimmed. There was no medical care for servants, just herbal paste, whispered prayers, and the hope you didn't slow down long enough to be noticed. Edric once watched a woman labor through laundry with a fever that made her see stars. She collapsed near the well. By sundown her bed was already taken. It was cruel, but it wasn't considered cruelty. It was just how things were. And yet through this fading some servants resisted invisibility in small ways. Marjorie sang when she worked, loud and off-key, daring people to ignore her. A man named Garrick, who used to fix tools, carved his name into the workbench. So they remember I did something, he told Edric. He was gone 3 weeks later. The name remained for another month until the steward sanded it out. Even Edric, still young by manor standards, began to wonder how many more winters before his back bent too far, before his knees refused stairs, before his hands trembled when pouring wine. Would someone care? Would anyone stop it? He asked Marjorie once softly what she wanted people to say when she was gone. She looked at him with something between pity and defiance. They won't say anything, but if one girl remembers how I told her not to let the bastards take her pride, that'll be enough. In the noble record books, the only names preserved were those tied to land, blood or scandal. Servants had no such legacy. They were the muscle behind the memory, the breath behind the banquet. And when they died, the manor adjusted. It didn't mourn. But among themselves, servants tried to remember each other. They told stories. They shared habit. Do you remember how Tomlin used to whistle before dawn? Marjorie always added extra lie when she was angry. These fragments stitched the dead into the living. Not legacy, but lineage of toil. And so, growing old in the manor wasn't about rest. It was about watching your own shadow fade while trying desperately to leave some sign that you'd been there. Edric didn't have children, no land, no surname that mattered, but he still hoped someone would remember his hands, the way he turned the bread without burning it, the way he folded towels like parchment, the way he once helped a crying maid find her shoes without asking why she'd lost them. In a world where your name didn't last, your kindness might, and maybe that was the only kind of memory worth chasing. By the time most servants grew too old to stand straight, they had long since stopped being called by name. Instead, they became her, or him, or worse, that one. Is that one still in the laundry? Tell her to move aside. Names were for the young, the useful, the ones still fast enough to matter. The rest simply lingered, like furniture no one wanted to admit was cracked. There was no memorial for a servant who died of age in a corner bed. No one carved a stone. No one sang. Sometimes a priest muttered something, sometimes not. Often the body was simply carted away, buried near the pig fields, or beside the old orchard, under unmarked soil, where weeds grew more enthusiastically than memory. The manor didn't have room for mourning. It barely had room for breathing. Edric had witnessed 3 such passings in one winter. Cold always hit hardest for the old. They didn't burn as hot. Their fingers didn't fight back. One by one, they stopped showing up for duties. And then, like snow melting underfoot, they were gone. Marjorie never spoke about them, but once, Edric found her tucking a small wooden spoon into her apron pocket, one that had belonged to a woman named Alice, who used to stir porridge like it was a sacred ritual. The spoon never left Marjorie's apron again. It was a kind of resistance, a way to say she mattered, because in the eyes of the manor, old servants didn't matter. They were replaced, not remembered, and yet, without them, the manor's memory meant nothing. Who else remembered how to mend the Lord's winter cloak without fraying the hem? Who remembered that the third step to the pantry creaked unless you stepped just right? Who remembered that the young mistress only ate barley when it was soaked in goat's milk overnight, not cow? The knowledge of the manor, its true, pulsing, working knowledge, lived not in books but in the bones of the old. Still, age was punished quietly. More duties disappeared. Chores shifted. Edric watched it happen to Marjorie over months. Tasks she'd done for years suddenly given to someone younger. No explanation, just the cold efficiency of the steward's tone. Let Bren take that now. It's better if Ellen handles it. You deserve a rest. Rest. The cruelest lie a servant could hear. What they meant was, we don't need you anymore, but we're too cowardly to say it out loud. Marjorie never argued. She knew better. She just adjusted, found new corners to sweep, new ways to matter. Once, Edric found her tending to a frayed rug in the hallway. Not her job, not anyone's really. It snags the Lord's robe, she said flatly, and I'm tired of hearing him blame the boy for tripping. Her body slowed, but her mind didn't, and that perhaps made her dangerous. She remembered too much, and the manor, for all its love of tradition, feared memory in those it no longer controlled. The younger servants began to whisper, some with reverence, some with fear. She's seen too much. She was here during the famine, wasn't she? Didn't she know the old cook who cursed the wine cellar? There were always rumors that she hid a stash of coins, that she once slapped a noblewoman, that she knew secrets buried in the manor walls. The truth was likely simpler. She survived, longer than expected, longer than permitted. One frosted morning, Edric found Marjorie sitting outside the back door, her shawl wrapped tightly, her hands folded like she was praying, but her eyes weren't closed. They were fixed on the treetops. When he asked if she was well, she simply said, "Don't let them make you quiet." He never forgot that. That same week, the steward told her she'd be retired to the abbey, a kind phrase for being shuffled out, where old servants were sent to monasteries or nunneries, usually not to pray but to die out of sight. No just a note sent with the wagon, useful for light work or needle repair, like livestock. Edric tried to protest. The steward raised an eyebrow. Would you like to join her? That night, the wagon came. Marjorie climbed aboard without a word. No luggage, just her apron, and that same wooden spoon. As the cart rolled away, she didn't look back, but Edric stood in the dark, watching the wheels shrink into the horizon, until they disappeared, and then the manor moved on. By morning, a new girl was sweeping the hearth. She moved quick, didn't speak much, had never heard of Marjorie, and the silence settled again. That was the cycle. Work until you break, then disappear, then be forgotten. But Edric wouldn't forget, not because Marjorie was family, servants didn't get that luxury, but because he knew one day he'd be the one moving slower, the one whose fingers couldn't grip the bucket, the one with too many memories and not enough muscle. And when that day came, he wondered, would anyone remember his name, or would he too become that one? So that night he did something small. He took a piece of chalk and wrote M beneath the stone lintel near the kitchen door, a place only servants passed. No one would notice it, not for a while, but maybe one day someone would ask, and someone else would remember, and maybe that would be enough. Chapter 12. Ghosts of the Hall. The manor was quietest in the late hours. That peculiar stillness, after the fires had died down, and the last noble had slurred his way into bed. To the untrained ear, it was silence. But to a servant like Edric, it was when the manor spoke loudest. The creak of a shutter, the thump of wood settling, the soft clink of cooling iron. It wasn't just sound, it was memory echoing through stone. Some called it superstition, others history. But among the servants, there was little doubt. The manor kept its ghosts, not the kind that wailed or rattled chains. These were subtler, felt, not seen. You might pass through a hallway and suddenly feel watched. You might hear your own name in a whisper, only to find the corridor empty. Edric had grown used to these sensations, not frightened by them, but oddly comforted. After all, who else remembered the dead, if not the house itself? One story, passed down for years, told of a girl named Annis, a kitchen maid who had fallen down the wine cellar stairs during a feast and broken her neck. The steward had told everyone she'd run away, but her apron was found days later, neatly folded behind the barrels. Ever since, her presence was felt in the kitchen, a cold draft near the ovens, spoons disappearing, herbs moved from one shelf to another. Tybalt once cursed her aloud after tripping. The ladle fell from its hook 5 seconds later. Coincidence? Perhaps, but no one mocked Annis after that. There were other tales: the scullery that smelled of lavender despite being scrubbed with vinegar, the attic that remained dry even during storms, where a former seamstress had been locked away after losing her sight. She'd sewn until the day she died. Sometimes, they said, you could hear threads snapping up there, softly, like wind catching silk. Even Marjorie, practical to the point of cruelty, once claimed she'd heard Tomlin's whistle after his dismissal. He's reminding them the front gate still squeaks, she said, then added, better ghosts than fools. But the strangest thing about these stories was not that they persisted, it was that they came only from servants. Nobles never spoke of them, either they didn't notice, or they didn't care. That was the truest division in the manor. Some people lived in its walls, others merely ruled them. Servants, by contrast, knew every groan and sigh, every beam that shifted, every tile that cracked, and when the living were too tired to remember, the dead whispered reminders. One evening, Edric was cleaning the hallway outside the library, a place few servants lingered. The nobles hated the smell of old parchment, and the steward claimed it housed spiders with the minds of monks. But Edric liked it there, it was quiet, safe. And on that night, he found something odd, a single footprint in dust, leading toward the far shelf, and then vanishing. He cleaned it. Of course he did, that was the job. But later that week, it appeared again, same spot, same shape, as if someone or something wanted to be seen, not in terror, just in memory. He didn't tell anyone. Who would listen? To speak of ghosts was to invite suspicion. Superstition was tolerated among nobles when it came from books, not from mouths stained with soot. Still, he started to leave small things behind: a thimble button, a folded scrap of linen, tiny offerings, not to appease, but to acknowledge. I know you were here, each one said, and I won't pretend you weren't. Over time, other servants seemed to follow suit. A loaf left on the back step, a name etched into the underside of a bench. These weren't rituals, just gestures, quiet defiance against forgetting. Because in the manor, being remembered was the closest thing to being free. Of course there were skeptics, newer boys who mocked the stories, who rolled their eyes and whistled through haunted halls. But even they changed, eventually. After a few weeks of cold breezes with no wind, of trays tipping without reason, of doors left ajar no matter how tightly they were closed, they stopped laughing. One even started saying "Good night, Annis," when locking the pantry. The steward, naturally, refused all such talk. You make your own ghosts, he snapped once, after someone mentioned missing boots. Idle hands breed nonsense, and perhaps he was right. Perhaps trauma clung like cobwebs, and over years it became legend. But even that truth didn't dull the power of presence. Because the real horror wasn't that ghosts might exist, it was that so many people lived and died in the manor, and no one remembered their names. That their backs bent for decades, their skin cracked from lie, their fingers bled from stitching, and in the end, there was no mark, no tomb, no line in a ledger, just the whisper of a name between kitchen walls. So if the house carried them, if the stone remembered, then maybe they were more real than the nobles' banners ever were. And Edric, though still young, understood what legacy meant for someone like him. It wasn't lineage, it wasn't wealth, it wasn't land, it was being remembered by those who knew what it cost to be forgotten. And if he ever left the manor, or if the manor left him, he hoped the walls would keep his name, not for glory, but so that some poor soul scrubbing a floor 50 years from now might pause, feel watched, and know, you're not alone. The manor did not age with grace. It sagged, groaned, and split like old bone under cold sky. But no one dared say so. Nobles spoke of it as timeless, a place rich in tradition, though its chimney bricks crumbled by the year and ivy clawed at every edge, like time itself, trying to reclaim what it once owned. For the servants, it was different. The manor was not a symbol, it was a body, and they lived in its stomach, knees and lungs. When the walls cracked, they were the ones who patched it. When the pipes froze, they boiled snow. When ceilings leaked, they moved buckets in the night. They kept it alive, and for that, it remembered them, in its own strange, half-alive way. It was often said, quietly, never in front of the steward, that certain places in the manor held more memory than others. The back staircase, narrow and damp, where maids had cried and boys had kissed, and sometimes both. The flagstone near the chapel that always shifted, no matter how often it was realigned. The shelf in the pantry where a loaf of bread once fell, untouched by human hands. Edric knew these places. He felt them, not with fear but with a familiarity that grew stronger each year. It wasn't superstition, it was recognition, because the longer you lived in the manor, the more you understood. Ghosts weren't spirits in the wind. Ghosts were what was left behind. The pain, the effort, the silence, the breath still trapped between stones. They were the bruises that never healed, the names never written down, the thousands of footsteps that wore grooves into stone without anyone ever looking down. Marjorie was gone, but not gone. Edric still heard her mutterings when the stew boiled too long. He still saw her apron edge in the corner of his eye when the fire flared, and when a servant cursed under their breath and didn't realize they were mimicking her rhythm. Edric said nothing, he just smiled. In many ways, she had become what she always feared, part of the walls, and maybe that wasn't the worst fate. One morning, while sweeping out the west corridor, a part of the manor, rarely visited now, Edric noticed something odd. A series of small scratches near the base of the wall. They looked like claw marks at first, then a single word carved so faintly you'd miss it if you blinked. Marg. He didn't touch it. He didn't trace it. He just swept around it carefully and moved on. That night, he returned with a scrap of candle wax and sealed it gently into the groove. It would hold for a season, maybe more. Long enough, he hoped, for someone else to notice, to wonder, to ask. Because that was how memory lived in places like this, not in ledgers or sermons or crests, but in scratches, in whispers, in the pause between footsteps. The steward never acknowledged the manor's ghosts. He didn't have to. He had ledgers, titles, parchment, but the servants knew better. They knew legacy had nothing to do with lineage. It was about being felt after you were gone, not in song, in silence. And what was the manor, really, without them? Would the bells ring themselves? Would the floors scrub themselves? Would the chamber pots leap out to be emptied? No, it was the invisible hands, the tired backs, the uncelebrated souls that kept the heartbeat going. Nobles might build the walls, but servants became them. There were no portraits of Edric, no poems written, but there were dents in the doorframe where he'd carried buckets too wide. There were faded smudges on the stair rail where his hand had always landed. And maybe, just maybe, someday a servant would find those and wonder who'd made them. And that wondering would be enough, because that meant someone had noticed. And if someone noticed, someone remembered. And if someone remembered, then the ghosts were not lost, they were home. So, after scrubbing floors, being called that one, and quietly vanishing behind stone walls, the big question is, what if we were there? What if you or I were just another nameless servant in that cold, echoing manor? Would we have followed orders, aged into invisibility, and died quietly? Maybe. But maybe not. Because even inside that brutal machine, where memory was a luxury and your spine was currency, there were cracks. And through those cracks, people like Marjorie left marks, small ones. A spoon tucked in a pocket, a chalk M beneath a doorway, tiny rebellions that whispered, I was here, I mattered, and if it were me, I'd write my name in every dark corner, stitch my story into the hem of the laundry, tell ghost stories not to scare but to warn. Build secret brotherhoods with coolest hands and quiet glances. Because if the nobles had parchment, we had stone, and stone remembers everything. So, no, maybe we couldn't burn the system, but we could haunt it. Quietly. Forever.